The women who shaped the Plantagenet dynasty did not rule England in name during most of those centuries, and yet the dynasty itself, its survival, its expansion, its internal wars, its moments of cultural brilliance, and its catastrophic collapses cannot be understood without tracing the decisions, alliances, sacrifices, and extraordinary force of will exercised by the women who stood at its center. The Plantagenet era, stretching from the middle of the 12th century to the final decade of the 15th, encompassed more than 300 years of English history, during which the nature of queenship, female agency, and dynastic power underwent transformations so profound that they permanently altered the relationship between women and political authority in the medieval world. To study only the kings, Henry II, Richard I, John, Henry III, Edward I, Edward II, Edward III, Richard II, and the Lancastrian and Yorkist monarchs who followed, is to study only the visible surface of a structure whose foundations were laid by women, whose names deserve to be spoken with the same gravity accorded to the men whose reigns they made possible. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The origins of the Plantagenet dynasty are inseparable from the ambitions of a single woman whose life constituted one of the most remarkable political careers produced by medieval Europe. Empress Matilda, born in the year 1102 as the daughter of Henry I of England and his Queen Matilda of Scotland, entered a world in which the succession to the English throne was already contested territory. Her father, who had seized the crown following the death of his elder brother William Rufus in the year 1100, understood with clarity that the legitimacy of his own line depended entirely on the production and protection of male heirs. When Matilda's brother, William Adelin, drowned in the wreck of the White Ship in the year 1120, the loss was not merely personal, but catastrophic in its dynastic implications. Henry I found himself, in the final decade of his reign, without a male heir, and the solution, he devised the formal designation of his daughter Matilda as his successor, set in motion a chain of events whose consequences would define English history for 3.5 centuries. Matilda had not been raised in obscurity or sheltered from the realities of power. At the age of 8, she had been sent to Germany to be betrothed to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, and by the time she was 12 years old, she had been formally married and crowned Queen of the Romans in Mainz Cathedral, beginning an education in statecraft and imperial governance that few individuals of either sex received in that era. She absorbed the mechanisms of German imperial administration, participated in the ceremonial life of the court, and gained direct experience of the ways in which power was negotiated, displayed, and maintained across vast territories. When Henry V died in the year 1125 without leaving legitimate children, Matilda returned to her father's court as a widow of 23, bearing the imperial title that she would retain for the rest of her life, and that gave her a prestige no other woman in England could match. Henry I recalled his magnates and clerics in the year 1127 and required them to swear an oath recognizing Matilda as his lawful heir and the future ruler of England and Normandy. This oath, administered with considerable formality at Windsor and repeated on subsequent occasions, was not a gesture toward abstract principle, but a calculated political act designed to secure the succession against the claims of Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois, whose proximity to the throne made him an obvious alternative candidate. The remarriage of Matilda in the year 1128 to Geoffrey of Anjou, a young count whose family controlled territories in France adjacent to the Norman Duchy, was arranged by Henry I with the explicit purpose of strengthening the defensive position of his heir. Geoffrey was 11 years younger than Matilda, and the marriage was personally uncongenial to her from its earliest stages, but the political logic underlying it was sound. The union of the English royal succession with Angevin military power created the combination that would eventually become the Plantagenet inheritance. The name Plantagenet itself derived from the broom plant, the Plantagenista, associated with the Counts of Anjou, and its adoption as a dynastic designation in later centuries reflected the foundational importance of this Angevin connection to the entire line that followed. Without Matilda's marriage to Geoffrey, the dynasty would not have existed. The political significance of this marriage cannot be overstated in any account of Plantagenet origins, for the entire territorial, cultural, and military character of the dynasty that Henry II would eventually establish derived its essential shape from the combination of Norman royal inheritance on one side and Angevin military tradition on the other, a combination that only Matilda's extraordinary trajectory through German imperial politics and back to the English succession made possible. Henry I died in the year 1135, and what followed was the period known to historians as the Anarchy, a civil war of nearly 2 decades, during which Matilda's claim to the English throne was contested by her cousin Stephen, who moved with remarkable speed to seize power in the weeks following Henry's death. Stephen's success in establishing himself as king in the winter of 1135 depended in large part on the support of the English church and the barons who had sworn oaths to Matilda but who found in Stephen a candidate more immediately available and, crucially, male. The political culture of 12th century England was not prepared to accept a ruling queen, and the resistance Matilda encountered when she finally landed in England in the year 1139 to press her claim exposed the depth of that cultural barrier with brutal clarity. She came not as a passive claimant waiting to be chosen, but as a determined military and political actor. She cultivated allies among the English baronage, maintained diplomatic contact with the Scottish crown through her uncle David I, and relied heavily on the military support of her illegitimate half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, one of the most capable commanders of his generation. The war that followed was fought across English soil for years, and its fluctuating fortunes subjected the civilian population to devastation that the monastic chroniclers of the period described with consistent horror. The record of these years in documents like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reveals the collapse of normal governance across wide regions of England, with baronial fortifications constructed without royal license, arbitrary taxation, and the absence of effective royal justice, creating conditions that contemporaries compared to the end of law itself. Matilda's moment of apparent triumph came in the year 1141, when, following the Battle of Lincoln in February of that year, Stephen was captured and imprisoned, and Matilda was formally recognized as Lady of the English, a title carefully distinguished from Queen, regnant by those who granted it, but one which acknowledged her political supremacy. She entered London in June of 1141 to negotiate the terms of a formal coronation, and it was here that her claim collapsed, not through military defeat, but through a failure of political judgment that the contemporary chronicler, John of Worcester, attributed to arrogance, and that modern historians have analysed more carefully as the consequence of impossible demands placed on a woman required to maintain authority in a culture that refused her the legitimating frameworks it extended automatically to men. She demanded financial exactions from the citizens of London that her predecessor had not imposed, and the Londoners rose in armed resistance, forcing her to flee the city. The moment passed. Stephen was released in exchange for Robert of Gloucester later that same year, and the war resumed with neither side capable of achieving final victory. The stalemate that characterized the final years of the anarchy was eventually resolved not by military decision, but by the political settlement of 1153, in which Stephen agreed to recognize Matilda's son Henry as his heir, effectively conceding the legitimacy of the claim that Matilda had spent 14 years pressing. The Treaty of Winchester, concluded in that year, was the formal acknowledgement that Stephen's kingship was the interruption and Henry's succession the restoration of the proper line, a conclusion that vindicated Matilda's position, even as it transferred the immediate beneficiary of that vindication to the next generation. Matilda never wore the crown of England. She returned to Normandy in the year 1148 and spent the remaining years of her life at Rouen, where she exercised real influence over the administration of the Norman Duchy and served as a crucial advisor to her son, Henry, who was growing into the formidable ruler who would become Henry II of England. Her role in those years was not decorative. She corresponded with Pope Alexander III, advised her son on matters of governance and policy, and maintained the kind of political engagement that constituted genuine power, even when exercised from behind the formal structure of male authority. The letters that survive from her correspondence with the papacy demonstrate a facility with Latin, a clarity of political argument, and a familiarity with the conventions of diplomatic communication that reflect the extraordinary education she had received during her years at the German imperial court. She was not a woman who had been marginalized into political insignificance, but one who had adapted the exercise of her considerable capabilities to the institutional channels available to her in the final decades of her life. She died in the year 1167, and the epitaph, later inscribed on her tomb, described her as the daughter of a king, the wife of a king, the mother of a king, a summary that acknowledged her extraordinary connections to royal authority, while conspicuously omitting her own claim to have been, however briefly and incompletely, a ruler in her own right. The Plantagenet dynasty that she made possible through her marriage, her wars, and her transmission of the imperial dignity to her son would endure for more than 3 centuries after her death. Henry II came to the English throne in the year 1154, following the death of Stephen. The settlement agreed at Winchester in the previous year, having recognised Henry as Stephen's heir, and thus bringing the period of civil war to a formal close. Henry brought with him not only the energy and political intelligence that would make him one of the most transformative monarchs in English history, but also a wife whose significance to the Plantagenet story rivaled and in certain respects exceeded his own. Eleanor of Aquitaine had been Queen of France before she became Queen of England, and the circumstances of her transition from one royal court to another constituted one of the most dramatic episodes in 12th century European politics. Born around the year 1122 as the daughter and eventual heiress of William X, Duke of Aquitaine and Count of Poitou, Eleanor inherited, at the age of approximately 15, one of the largest and wealthiest territories in France, a duchy whose cultural vitality and political complexity made its governance a challenge that would have tested a ruler twice her age with 10 times her experience. Within 3 months of her father's death, she had been married to Louis, the eldest surviving son of the French king, Louis VI, and within weeks of that marriage, she had become Queen of France when the elder Louis died. She was thus, within a single summer, transformed from a ducal heiress into a Queen of France, all before her 16th birthday. The territorial wealth that Eleanor brought to her marriage with Louis VII was staggering in its implications for the political geography of France. Aquitaine and Poitou, together, constituted a territory substantially larger than the royal domain of the Capetian kings, and their integration with the French crown through Eleanor's marriage created a concentration of political resources in the Queen's hands that had no precedent in the experience of the French kingdom. Eleanor proved from the earliest years of her marriage to be a woman who understood the significance of this territorial advantage and who was unwilling to surrender it to the passive role that the conventional expectations of French queenship would have imposed. The governance of her ducal territories required attention, administrative decisions, and the cultivation of loyalties among the Aquitanian and Poitevin nobility that could not be conducted at a distance through intermediaries, alone, and the tensions this created between Eleanor's responsibilities as Duchess and her obligations as Queen of France were evident throughout the 15 years of her French marriage. Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII of France. France lasted 15 years and produced 2 daughters but no sons. The absence of a male heir was sufficient reason for the political minds of the 12th century to consider the marriage a failure, but the documented tensions between Eleanor and Louis went considerably deeper than the dynastic problem of infertility. Eleanor accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, which departed in the year 1147, and the experience exposed with particular sharpness the incompatibility of their temperaments and political instincts. The Crusade was a military catastrophe from which the French forces emerged with diminished prestige and substantial losses, and the personal relationship between Louis and Eleanor deteriorated during the campaign, in ways that generated scandal sufficient to persist in the historical record for centuries. The specific accusations made against Eleanor of conducting an affair with her uncle Raymond of Antioch, whose hospitality the crusading army enjoyed during the winter of 1148, cannot be verified from the surviving evidence and were likely exaggerated or invented by hostile sources, but the estrangement between the royal couple was real and consequential. Eleanor asked Louis for an annulment during the stop in Antioch, and while he refused at that moment, the eventual dissolution of the marriage in the year 1152 was accomplished on the grounds of consanguinity, the shared ancestry that church law required as a formal basis for annulment, even when the real reasons were political and personal rather than theological. The ecclesiastical council that pronounced the annulment at Beaugency in March of 1152 returned to Eleanor the full independent governance of her ducal territories, a consequence that made the political calculation underlying the annulment decision immediately apparent to observers across Europe. The annulment freed Eleanor to remarry, and the speed with which she contracted a new marriage revealed the extent to which her political situation demanded urgent resolution. Within 2 months of the annulment, she was married to Henry, Count of Anjou, Duke of Normandy, and heir to the English throne, a man 11 years, her junior, whose political prospects were considerably more dynamic than Louis VII's had been. The marriage transformed the political geography of Western France overnight. The combination of Henry's Norman and Angevin territories with Eleanor's Aquitanian duchy created a concentration of power in France that dwarfed the actual landholdings of the French crown and created the tensions between the Plantagenet kings and the Capetian dynasty that would structure European politics for generations. Eleanor brought to the marriage not merely territory but the cultural and administrative traditions of the most sophisticated ducal court in France, a tradition of patronage and intellectual life that would leave identifiable marks on the cultural character of the Plantagenet court for decades. The troubadour culture that had flourished in Aquitaine under Eleanor's family found expression at the Plantagenet court through Eleanor's sustained interest in vernacular literature and courtly performance. And while the later medieval elaborations of the court of love associated with Eleanor require careful scholarly skepticism, the genuine cultural vitality she brought to her court is not in doubt. The connection between Eleanor's patronage and the flowering of Occitan vernacular literary culture that characterized the 12th century Aquitanian court represents one of the more underappreciated contributions of the Plantagenet queens to the intellectual life of medieval Europe. Eleanor bore Henry II 8 children, who survived to adulthood or near adulthood, including the future kings Henry the Young King, Richard I, John, and Geoffrey of Brittany, as well as daughters whose marriages to European rulers extended Plantagenet diplomatic reach across the continent. The management of this large family, conducted across the various territories of the Angevin Empire, while Henry himself moved constantly between England, Normandy, Anjou, and other domains, fell substantially to Eleanor, who governed Aquitaine with considerable autonomy during the periods when Henry's attention was directed elsewhere, and who served as regent of England on multiple occasions. The political education she provided to her sons, particularly to Richard, whose upbringing in Aquitaine placed him closely within her sphere of influence, shaped the political character of the rulers who would follow Henry II in ways that cannot be reduced to mere maternal sentiment. Eleanor was transmitting the governance traditions of a duchy, training a future king in the administrative and military realities of a territory he would eventually hold, and embedding in Richard a particular understanding of kingship that drew on Aquitanian as much as English precedent. The relationship between Eleanor and Richard, which was closer and more politically significant than her relationships with her other sons, constituted in effect an apprenticeship in Angevin rule, conducted through the medium of a mother's sustained engagement with her heir's education and character formation. The relationship between Eleanor and Henry II collapsed definitively in the early 1170s, and the circumstances of its collapse reveal with considerable clarity the nature of the tensions that had been building within the Plantagenet family for years. Henry's relationship with Rosamund Clifford, whatever its precise character and duration, was understood by contemporaries as a cause of Eleanor's resentment, and the political rebellion of 1173 and 1174, in which Eleanor's sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey all rose in arms against their father, was associated in the contemporary mind with Eleanor's instigation and support. Whether Eleanor actively organized the rebellion, or whether she provided it with legitimacy and encouragement while leaving the military direction to others, cannot be determined with certainty from the surviving sources. But Henry II clearly believed her responsible enough to take the extraordinary step of imprisoning her following the rebellion's collapse in 1174. Eleanor was held in various degrees of confinement for the next 15 years, until Henry II's death in the summer of 1189, during which time she was denied the freedom of movement and political action that had characterized the first 20 years of her marriage. The imprisonment was not a dungeon sentence. She was housed in reasonable comfort at various locations, including Winchester Castle and Salisbury Tower, but it was real confinement that removed her from effective political participation and constituted one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune endured by any woman in medieval English history. The 15 years of Eleanor's imprisonment represent a period during which the Angevin Empire continued to function, more or less, but without the guidance of the woman who had been among its most capable administrators and most perceptive political analysts. Henry II died in July of 1189 at Chinon, having learned in his final days that his son John, the child he had trusted most, had joined the rebellion organized by Richard and supported by the French king Philip II. Richard became king, and one of his first acts was to release his mother from confinement. Eleanor was 67 years old when she emerged from imprisonment, and the energy with which she immediately resumed political activity suggests that the years of confinement had suppressed but not extinguished the political capabilities she had spent a lifetime developing. She governed England during the first months of Richard's reign while he prepared for the Third Crusade, travelling through the country at a pace that demonstrated both her physical vitality and her determination to reassert authority. She crossed the Pyrenees in the winter of 1190 to collect Richard's intended bride Berengaria of Navarre from the court of her father King Sancho VI, escorting the young woman to Sicily, where Richard was wintering with his crusading fleet, and then continued her political activities from England, while Richard was absent in the eastern Mediterranean. The administrative record of Eleanor's governance of England during Richard's crusade reveals a woman operating at the apex of her capabilities, issuing writs, managing the royal household, and maintaining the political stability that the king's long absence made perpetually fragile. When Richard was captured by the Duke of Austria in December of 1192 on his return from the crusade, Eleanor's response was precisely what might have been expected from a woman who had spent 4 decades navigating the most demanding political environments in Europe. She organized the collection of the enormous ransom demanded for Richard's release, 100,000 marks of silver, an amount equivalent to approximately twice the annual revenue of the English crown, coordinating the administrative effort across England and the continental territories, corresponding with Pope Celestine III to demand papal pressure on the Emperor Henry VI, who held Richard captive, and maintaining political stability in England during the prolonged crisis of a king's absence and captivity. Richard I died in April of 1199 from a wound sustained at the siege of Chalus-Chabrol in the Limousin, and Eleanor, now in her late 70s, navigated the succession crisis with the same combination of political realism and dynastic loyalty that had characterized her entire career. The succession lay between her surviving sons, and the choice between Richard's nominated heir Arthur of Brittany, who held the support of the Angevin and Maine barons, and John required immediate resolution before the political situation crystallized into civil war. Eleanor threw her support behind John, travelling through Aquitaine to receive the homage of the Poitevin lords for her new king before John had secured his position elsewhere. The journey she undertook in the winter and spring of 1199 to consolidate Plantagenet authority in her duchy was not the activity of a woman past her political prime, but of a ruler who understood, with complete clarity, which decisions mattered most in the first weeks of a new reign. The speed and geographical extent of her movements during this period, documented in the itinerary that can be reconstructed from the surviving administrative records, make her activity in the months following Richard's death among the most impressive examples of political crisis management in the entire Plantagenet story. She died in the spring of 1204 at the age of approximately 82, having outlived two of her sons who were kings, having spent 15 years in imprisonment, having crossed the Pyrenees in winter in her late 60s, and having exercised political authority of a kind that would not be systematically exercised by another English queen for more than 3 centuries. She was buried at the Abbey of Fontevraud in Anjou, where she rests beside Henry II and Richard I, the complexity of those relationships preserved in the proximity of their tombs. The reign of John, which began in 1199 and ended with his death in October 1216, brought to prominence a woman whose significance to the Plantagenet story has been persistently underestimated in the popular understanding of this period. Isabella of Angoulême, who became John's queen in the summer of 1200, resulting from one of the most politically consequential marriages of the medieval period, was approximately 12 years old at the time of her marriage, and her betrothal to Hugh, the 9th of Lusignan, which John's abduction of her dissolved, created a grievance that the Lusignan family pursued through the court of Philip II of France, and that provided the legal pretext for the confiscation of the continental Plantagenet territories that followed. The loss of Normandy in 1204 and the subsequent erosion of Angevin power in France were consequences that flowed at least in part from the political disruption John created when he married Isabella. The long-term significance of this disruption cannot be measured simply in terms of the territories lost during John's reign, for the continental dispossession that began with the fall of Normandy created the territorial grievances and strategic vulnerabilities that would drive English foreign policy for the next 2.5 centuries, fueling the 100 Years' War and the repeated attempts of successive Plantagenet kings to recover by force what John's political miscalculation had cost the dynasty. The marriage itself produced a significant number of children, including the future King Henry III, born in 1207, and Isabella bore her queenly duties with apparent composure during the difficult years of John's reign, which included the interdict placed on England by Pope Innocent III, the baronial rebellion that led to Magna Carta in 1215, and the French invasion that accompanied the revolt of the barons in 1216. John died in October of 1216, leaving a kingdom in crisis, a 9-year-old heir, and a political situation that required immediate resolution. The speed and effectiveness with which the minority government moved to stabilize the kingdom, issuing a revised version of Magna Carta, mobilizing the loyalty of the moderates among the baronage, and eventually defeating the French forces under Louis the Lion at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, reflected the institutional resilience of the English royal administration, which had survived John's reign and its accumulated damage sufficiently intact to function effectively under the direction of the Regency Council. Isabella's role in the aftermath of John's death has been obscured by the attention naturally drawn to the Regency government, dominated by the aging William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, whose reputation as the greatest knight of his age lent the Regency an aura of martial legitimacy that helped stabilize a kingdom in which a French prince controlled a substantial portion of English territory. But Isabella departed England in 1217 to return to Angoulême, and in 1220 she did something that demonstrated with great clarity the independence of her political judgment. She married Hugh X of Lusignan, the son of the man to whom she had been betrothed before John married her, completing a union that had been interrupted 20 years earlier by royal abduction and dynastic calculation. The marriage produced a large number of children and created a Lusignan dynasty in France that would have significant interactions with the English crown in subsequent decades, her Lusignan sons eventually coming to England to seek advancement at the court of their half-brother Henry III, and generating the baronial resentment that accompanied their presence there. Isabella pursued her own political interests in France with considerable energy, participating in a conspiracy against the French king Louis IX in 1241 that, when it was discovered, forced her to take refuge in Fontevraud Abbey, where she died in 1246. Her story does not fit comfortably into the conventional narrative of queenly virtue and selfless maternal devotion that later historiography tended to prefer, which may explain why it has received less attention than it deserves. Isabella of Angoulême was a woman who, having fulfilled her obligations to one husband and one kingdom, chose to pursue her own political and personal interests with a directness that medieval commentators found troubling and that modern historians ought to find illuminating. The attempt by the Regency Council after John's death to retain her in England as part of the institutional continuity of the minority government was resisted by Isabella with sufficient determination to make her departure effectively unstoppable, and her subsequent life in France represents a parallel political career of considerable interest that has been largely ignored in English historiographical tradition because it did not occur within the institutional boundaries of the Valois English kingdom. The women of the Plantagenet dynasty were not exclusively English in their political significance, and Isabella's Angevin and French career after her departure from England is a reminder of the extent to which the Plantagenet story was embedded in a continental political world that no account centered solely on England can adequately represent. The minority of Henry III, which lasted from 1216 until his assumption of personal rule in the early 1220s, was a period during which the governance of England rested on a combination of the Regency Council, the authority of the papal legate, and the institutional momentum of the royal administration. Henry himself grew into a ruler whose character was, in certain respects, defined by the insecurity of those early years, and the women who surrounded him during his minority and his adult reign shaped his understanding of politics and governance in ways that deserve careful examination. The influence of women during a minority was often indirect, operating through the educational arrangements made for the young king, through the cultural atmosphere of the household in which he was raised, and through the dynastic connections that tied the English crown to foreign powers, but it was not therefore insignificant. The formation of Henry III's character, which combined genuine artistic sensitivity, intense personal piety, and a capacity for political misjudgment that would eventually produce the constitutional crisis of the 1350s and 1360s, cannot be fully understood without attention to the environment in which he was raised, and that environment was shaped substantially by women whose influence has not received adequate historical attention. Henry III married Eleanor of Provence in January 1236, and the marriage, arranged as part of a diplomatic strategy to build alliances in southern France, brought to England a woman of considerable cultural sophistication whose influence on the court's intellectual and artistic life was substantial. Eleanor was the daughter of Raymond Berenger IV, Count of Provence, and her family connections included some of the most prominent literary and cultural figures of 13th century southern France. She brought with her to England not only relatives who sought and obtained positions at the English court, a circumstance that generated persistent baronial resentment and contributed to the political tensions of Henry's reign, but also cultural interests and aesthetic sensibilities that left visible marks on the patronage and material culture of the English royal household. The construction and decoration of royal buildings, the commissioning of manuscripts and devotional objects, and the general elevation of the material standards of the English court during the middle decades of the 13th century all reflect the influence of Eleanor of Provence's presence and her active participation in decisions about royal expenditure and cultural display. Eleanor was a significant figure in her own right in the political life of Henry's reign. She corresponded with foreign rulers, participated in diplomatic negotiations, and maintained close relationships with the papal curia that gave her channels of communication unavailable to most of her contemporaries. When Henry faced the baronial reform movement of the 1250s and 1260s, which culminated in the provisions of Oxford of 1258 and the subsequent civil war, known as the Barons' War, Eleanor was active in organising continental support for the royal cause. She negotiated with the French king Louis IX, sought financial and military assistance from her relatives in Provence and Savoy, and helped manage the diplomatic isolation that threatened the Plantagenet position during the period when Simon de Montfort exercised dominant authority in England following the Battle of Lewes in 1264. The capture of Henry III and his son Edward at the Battle of Lewes in May 1264, an event that left Simon de Montfort in effective control of the English government for more than a year, created a crisis that required Eleanor to take direct action from her position in France. She organized the raising of mercenary forces and worked to build a coalition of continental allies who might intervene on behalf of the captive king and prince. Her efforts were frustrated by the difficulty of coordinating military action from abroad and by the speed with which Edward escaped captivity and reversed the military situation at the Battle of Evesham in August 1265. But her political activity during this period demonstrates the extent to which she functioned as an independent political agent, rather than merely as a royal consort dependent on her husband's authority. The resources she deployed, the diplomatic connections she activated, and the organizational capacity she demonstrated during this crisis all reflect capabilities that had been developed over decades of political engagement at a major European court. Eleanor survived Henry III, who died in November 1272, and spent the remaining years of her life at Amesbury Priory in Wiltshire, where she took the veil as a nun in 1276. The choice of religious life following the death of a husband was a common and socially approved option for royal widows of the period, providing institutional stability, relative security from political manipulation, and the spiritual benefits that were understood to accompany formal religious profession. Eleanor died in June 1291, having outlived her husband by nearly 19 years, and witnessed the reign of her son Edward I transform the political character of English monarchy. Her contributions to English cultural life, through her patronage and her sustained engagement with the literary and artistic traditions of Provence, represent a dimension of her significance that sits alongside the more conventionally recognized political activities, and the combination of these two dimensions of her career gives Eleanor of Provence a place in the Plantagenet story that exceeds the limited recognition she has typically received in popular historical accounts. Eleanor of Castile, who became the wife of Edward I in 1254. When both were very young, Edward was 15, and Eleanor approximately 9 or 10, developed over the course of more than 3 decades of marriage. A partnership with her husband that has been analysed by historians as one of the more functional and emotionally significant relationships in medieval English royal history. Edward and Eleanor travelled together extensively, including on crusade in 1270, where Eleanor accompanied her husband to the eastern Mediterranean in a demonstration of marital commitment that was unusual for the period and that generated the famous, if historically questionable, legend of Eleanor sucking poison from Edward's wound at Acre. The legend, whatever its factual basis, reflects the contemporary perception of their relationship as unusually close, and the cultural investment that contemporaries made in the idea of the devoted royal wife as a counterweight to the ferocity of royal warfare. Eleanor bore Edward at least 14 children, and possibly more, of whom a relatively small number survived to adulthood. The management of childbearing at this scale, across decades of frequent travel and in the demanding physical conditions of royal life in the 13th century, represented an achievement of physical endurance that deserves acknowledgement alongside the more intellectually valorized dimensions of queenly activity. She exercised administrative responsibilities during Edward's frequent absences and maintained her own household administration with a degree of sophistication that the surviving records of her accounts reveal in considerable detail. Eleanor of Castile was an active participant in the land market, acquiring properties in England through purchase and exchange in ways that generated resentment among the English baronage, who regarded her accumulation of English landholdings as inappropriate exploitation of royal favour. The complaints about Eleanor's land transactions, which appear in the records of the Parliament of 1290, suggest that she was a more vigorous economic actor than the idealized image of the devoted wife and mother that later tradition tended to impose on her memory. The scale of her land acquisitions and the methods used to achieve them, including the exploitation of rights of wardship and the use of Jewish financiers as intermediaries in transactions that were structured to avoid the appearance of direct royal involvement in usury, reflected a sophisticated understanding of the English property market and a willingness to use the privileges of royal status to accumulate landed wealth that was more characteristic of a politically active baron than of the conventional image of a pious and charitable queen. Eleanor died in November 1290 at Harby in Nottinghamshire, and Edward I's response to her death was one of the most elaborate and visible expressions of royal grief recorded in medieval English history. He commissioned the construction of 12 memorial crosses at each of the places where her funeral cortege rested on its journey from Harby to Westminster, the Eleanor crosses, which represented a level of architectural investment and public mourning that went considerably beyond the conventional requirements of royal funerary commemoration. The crosses were works of considerable artistic quality, designed by accomplished sculptors and constructed in stone at considerable expense, and they constituted a permanent transformation of the English landscape in memory of a queen. The artistic programs of the Eleanor crosses, which incorporated heraldic imagery, sculptural representations of the queen, and the decorative vocabulary of the high Gothic style that Edward favoured in his architectural patronage, reflect the intersection of personal loss and political statement that royal commemoration in the medieval period consistently achieved. The crosses were not merely grief made physical, but assertions of the continued significance of the woman they commemorated, maintained in the visible landscape of English roads and market towns as permanent reminders of the queen who had been their subject. The Charing Cross of London, though the original structure has long since been destroyed and replaced by a Victorian reproduction, preserves in its name the memory of one of Eleanor's resting places, an incidental survival that speaks to the depth of the impression left by her death and its commemoration. Edward I remarried in 1299, taking as his second wife Margaret of France, who was approximately 35 years younger than him, and who bore him 3 children before his death in 1207. The reign of Edward II, which began in 1207 and ended in his forced abdication in January 1227 and his murder at Berkeley Castle in September of the same year, brought to the centre of Plantagenet political life the figure of Isabella of France, whose career as wife, queen, mother, rebel, and regent constitutes one of the most dramatic narratives in medieval English history. Isabella was the daughter of Philip IV of France, born approximately in 1295, and she was married to Edward II in January 1208 when she was approximately 12 years old. The marriage had been arranged as part of the resolution of territorial disputes between England and France, and it brought Isabella into a court that was already dominated by the influence of Piers Gaveston, the Gascon favourite, whose relationship with Edward II generated hostility among the English baronage, and whose execution by the earls in 1212 removed him from the scene, but did not resolve the underlying dysfunction of Edward's court and governance. Isabella's position during the first decade of her marriage was complicated by the competing claims on Edward's attention and affection, and the surviving evidence suggests that she navigated this situation with considerable skill, maintaining outward composure while cultivating the relationships with the English baronage and the French royal family that would eventually enable her to act decisively when the opportunity arose. Edward II was not simply an ineffective ruler who preferred favourites to governance, though the chronicles produced by his opponents painted him in precisely those terms. He was a king whose personal interests in swimming, rowing, threshing, and the company of men of lower social rank were genuinely alien to the expectations of the nobility he was required to govern, and whose inability to perform the martial and ceremonial aspects of medieval kingship with conviction fatally undermined the respect that effective rule required. The defeat at Bannockburn in June 1214, in which the English army was routed by Robert the Bruce's Scottish forces, and the prospect of English dominion over Scotland was definitively lost for the foreseeable future, represented a military catastrophe whose political consequences included the consolidation of baronial opposition to Edward's rule. The years that followed were marked by the dominance of Thomas of Lancaster, the king's cousin, whose execution in 1222, following his own failed rebellion against Edward's favourites, the Despensers, marked the eclipse of that opposition without resolving the fundamental problems of Edward's kingship. The Despensers, father and son, who dominated Edward's court in the years after Gaveston's death, exercised a kind of influence over the king that the baronage found intolerable, and whose financial exactions from the nobility generated the concentrated resentment that would eventually coalesce around Isabella as an alternative pole of authority. The elder Despenser's accumulation of lands and offices through the exploitation of royal favour, combined with the younger Despenser's direct access to the king's personal confidence, created a political situation in which the conventional mechanisms of baronial complaint and parliamentary pressure proved inadequate to produce reform. Isabella travelled to France in the summer of 1200 and Minutes 25, ostensibly to negotiate with her brother Charles IV on matters related to the English territories in France. She had spent years cultivating a relationship with Roger Mortimer, one of the principal baronial opponents of the Despensers, who had escaped from the Tower of London in 1223 and taken refuge at the French court. The exact nature of the relationship between Isabella and Mortimer has been debated by historians since the medieval period, and the contemporary chronicles that described them as lovers were written by sources hostile to Isabella. But the political partnership between them was real and consequential, regardless of its personal dimensions. Isabella refused to return to England and gathered around her at the French court a group of English exiles and mercenary forces that represented the nucleus of an invasion force. Her son, Edward, the future Edward III, was brought to France in the autumn of 1225 under the pretext of doing homage to Charles IV for the English territories in France, and Isabella refused to send him back, keeping him with her as the indispensable dynastic legitimacy that her enterprise required. Without Edward, Isabella's invasion would have been a rebellion. With him, it was a regency operation conducted by a mother on behalf of her son's inheritance. The invasion that Isabella and Mortimer launched in September 1226 landed in Suffolk with a relatively small force, but generated an extraordinary political response. Support for Edward II collapsed with a rapidity that reflected the depth of the resentment against the Despensers and the failure of Edward's governance, and within weeks the king had fled to Wales. The Despensers had been captured and executed, and the political situation had been transformed beyond recognition. The speed of this collapse, a regime that had maintained itself by force for years, dissolving within weeks of a small invading force landing on English soil, speaks to the exhaustion of whatever political legitimacy Edward II's government had retained, and to the effectiveness with which Isabella and Mortimer had prepared the ground through their contacts with the English baronage. Edward II was captured in November 1226, imprisoned at Kenilworth, and compelled to abdicate in January 1227, the formal transfer of power to his son Edward III being achieved through a parliamentary process whose legitimacy was questionable, but whose political necessity was overwhelming. The abdication ceremony at Kenilworth, in which a delegation of bishops, barons, and representatives of the commons presented Edward with the formal renunciation of his kingship, and received from him the acknowledgement of that renunciation, was a constitutional innovation whose precedent would eventually be invoked in the deposition of Richard II 7 decades later. Isabella governed England as regent for her son from 1227 to 1230, with Mortimer exercising an influence over the governance of the realm that the council and the young king found increasingly difficult to accept. The regime's management of Scottish affairs, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1228, which acknowledged Scottish independence and the validity of Robert the Bruce's kingship, was bitterly unpopular in England and was condemned by contemporaries as a shameful abandonment of the position won by Edward I at enormous cost in blood and treasure over 3 decades of Scottish warfare. The financial exactions that Isabella and Mortimer imposed, the accumulation of wealth and lands in Mortimer's hands, and the general perception that the regent's government was exploiting its position for private benefit at the kingdom's expense, all created the conditions for a reaction by the young Edward III. In October 1230, Edward, now 17 years old, organised a coup at Nottingham Castle, arresting Mortimer in Isabella's own quarters and sending him to the Tower of London, from which he was transferred to execution at Tyburn in November. The planning of this coup, which required the cooperation of a small group of trusted associates and the physical penetration of the castle through a passage known to few, demonstrated the political maturity and determination that Edward III would bring to the management of English affairs for the next half-century. Isabella was not harmed. Edward treated his mother with a formal respect that masked the effective end of her political authority, providing her with an income and accommodations that were comfortable, but that constituted a removal from the centre of power, as complete as the imprisonment that John had imposed on Eleanor of Aquitaine half a century earlier. She lived until 1258, spending her final years at Castle Rising in Norfolk, visited by Edward and by her grandchildren with apparent regularity, and dying at the age of approximately 63 after a reign of 3 years as effective ruler of England and nearly 30 years as its queen. The judgment that history has passed on Isabella of France has fluctuated considerably over the centuries. From the hostile characterizations of medieval chroniclers, who emphasized her adultery and her persecution of her husband, to the more nuanced assessments of modern historians, who have placed her actions within the context of the political failures and personal provocations that preceded them. Whatever judgment one reaches on the ethics of her deposition of Edward II, the political capability she demonstrated in organizing and executing that deposition, and in maintaining governance of England during the difficult early years of her son's minority, represents an achievement of the first order by any standard of political accomplishment. The reign of Edward III, which lasted from 1227 to 1377, half a century of transformation that included the beginning of the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, and the flowering of a particular form of English court culture, was shaped by women whose influence operated at different levels and through different mechanisms. Philippa of Hainault, who became Edward's queen, following their marriage in January 1228, brought to the English court a temperament that contemporary chronicles consistently described in terms of gentleness, mercy, and intercession, and while these descriptions reflect the conventions of queenly representation rather than neutral observation, the specific incidents they record suggest a woman who was both personally popular and politically effective in ways that the conventions partially obscure. Philippa was the daughter of William I, Count of Hainault, and her family connections provided Edward III with diplomatic links to the Low Countries that proved strategically important during the early phases of the 100 Years' War. When the English alliance with the Flemish cities against France was a cornerstone of military strategy, the wool trade that connected English producers with Flemish weavers was the economic foundation of this alliance, and the management of its political dimensions required sustained diplomatic attention of a kind that Philippa's family connections uniquely facilitated. She accompanied Edward on military campaigns, including the Scottish expedition of 1336 and the famous incident at Calais in 1347, in which Philippa is described as interceding with Edward to spare the lives of the 6 burghers of Calais, who had surrendered the city and whom Edward had initially intended to execute, reflects whether or not it is entirely historically accurate, the consistent pattern of her public role as a softening influence on royal authority that made her genuinely beloved in ways that few medieval queens achieved. The cultural patronage she exercised at the English court, including her support for Geoffrey Chaucer, who served in her household and whose early career was sustained by her patronage, contributed to the development of the English vernacular literary tradition that would reach its greatest expression in the Canterbury Tales, and that constitutes one of the most significant cultural legacies of the Plantagenet period. Philippa's role in shaping the cultural environment within which Chaucer developed his craft represents a contribution to English literary history whose significance extends far beyond the conventional boundaries of queenly patronage, into the foundational history of English literature itself. She bore Edward 12 children, of whom several survived to adulthood, and whose subsequent dynastic entanglements would define the political history of England for the following century. She died in August 1369, and Edward III's subsequent decline into an old age dominated by the influence of Alice Perez, his mistress in his final years, was understood by contemporaries as a measure of what had been lost with Philippa's death. Alice Perez herself deserves more than dismissal as a corrupting influence on a senescent king. She was a woman of obscure origins who rose to a position of extraordinary influence at the English court through a combination of personal charm, considerable intelligence, and the ability to navigate the treacherous currents of court politics with remarkable skill. Her influence over Edward III in his final years was substantial enough that the Good Parliament of 1376 formally demanded her expulsion from court, making her one of the very few women in medieval English history to be the subject of parliamentary action. The charges against her centered on her financial exploitation of royal favor, her accumulation of property and wealth through the king's munificence, and her interference in legal proceedings, including the notorious incident in which she is reported to have sat beside the judge during a legal case in which she had an interest, an act that contemporaries regarded as a grotesque inversion of the proper relationship between royal favor and the administration of justice. She was present at Edward's deathbed in June 1377, and the stories told of her behavior there stripping rings from the dying king's fingers as he lay unconscious may be hostile invention, but they reflect the concentrated resentment of an establishment that had found her rise intolerable and that expressed that resentment in the most vivid terms available to it. Alice Perez survived Edward's death, was prosecuted and exiled, returned to England, and died in obscurity sometime around 1380, having demonstrated that the margins of political power were accessible to women of determined character, even when the formal structures of governance remained closed to them. The reign of Richard II, which began in 1377 and ended in his deposition in 1399, was bounded at its beginning and its end by the influence of women whose significance to the Plantagenet story operated through mechanisms of cultural patronage and dynastic inheritance rather than direct political action. Richard's first wife, Anne of Bohemia, whom he married in January 1382, was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV and sister of the Emperor Wenceslaus. The marriage, negotiated with considerable diplomatic difficulty given that the English had little of material value to offer the Bohemian imperial family in exchange for an imperial princess, brought to the English court a woman whose intellectual interests and personal character appear to have genuinely complemented Richard's own temperament. Anne was, by contemporary accounts, learned and pious, and the cultural connections her presence at the English court established between England and Bohemia had consequences that would only become apparent in the following century. The Bohemian scholars who came to England in her train encountered the writings of John Wycliffe and the Lollard movement, and when they returned to Bohemia, they carried with them ideas that would contribute to the development of the Hussite movement under Jan Hus, creating an intellectual chain of transmission that connected the religious descent of Plantagenet England to the religious upheavals of 15th century Central Europe. This connection between the Queen's household and the transmission of reformist religious ideas represents one of the more unexpected contributions of a Plantagenet queen to European intellectual history, and it operated through the culturally promiscuous environment of a cosmopolitan court rather than through any deliberate theological program. Anne died in June 1394 without having produced children, and Richard's grief at her death was displayed with an extravagance that contemporaries found remarkable, including reportedly ordering the demolition of the palace at Sheen, where she had died. His remarriage in 1396 to Isabella of Valois, the 6-year-old daughter of the French King Charles VI, was a diplomatic arrangement designed to secure the truce with France that Richard's peace-oriented foreign policy required, and the child queen was not in any meaningful sense a political actor, during the remaining years of Richard's reign. When Richard was deposed in September 1399 by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV and inaugurated the Lancastrian branch of the Plantagenet line, Isabella was returned to France, where she eventually married Charles of Orleans and died in 1409 at the age of 20 following childbirth. The deposition of Richard II and the usurpation of Henry IV in 1399 marked a rupture in the Plantagenet line that would eventually generate the dynastic crisis known as the Wars of the First. Roses, and the women who navigated that crisis as wives of rival claimants, mothers of contested heirs, and political actors in their own right, constitute the final, and in certain respects, most dramatic chapter of the story of women's influence on Plantagenet governance. Before turning to the mid-15th century, it is important to examine the contribution of women to the Lancastrian period of the Plantagenet inheritance, particularly the figure of Catherine of Valois, whose marriage to Henry V and whose subsequent widowhood created the dynastic circumstances from which the Tudor dynasty would eventually emerge. Henry IV's first wife, Mary de Bohun, had died in 1394, having borne him 7 children, including the future Henry V, and his second marriage to Joan of Navarre, the widow of the Duke of Brittany, in 1203, was primarily a diplomatic arrangement designed to secure an alliance with Brittany during the complex continental politics of the early 15th century. Joan brought to England her Breton connections and a political intelligence that made her a useful participant in the management of court affairs, but her later history is marked by one of the most unjust episodes in the careers of Plantagenet queens. In 1419, following Henry IV's death, in 1413, Joan was accused of witchcraft by her stepson, Henry V, arrested and imprisoned for approximately 3 years, a persecution that appears to have been motivated primarily by the desire to sequester her substantial dower income for the prosecution of the French War, rather than by any genuine belief in her guilt. The accusation of witchcraft, deployed as a political weapon against a wealthy widow whose resources were needed for military purposes, represents one of the more cynical applications of the legal mechanisms available to a medieval king against a woman whose only significant vulnerability was her dependence on royal goodwill for the security of her property. She was released in 1422, shortly before Henry V's own death, and survived until 1437, demonstrating the physical resilience that medieval women of the royal class were apparently required to demonstrate. Catherine of Valois, whom Henry V married in June 1420, following the military triumph at Agincourt and the Treaty of Troyes, was the daughter of the French king Charles VI and his queen Isabeau of Bavaria, and her marriage to Henry represented the culmination of the Plantagenet claim to the French throne that had been the organizing purpose of the 100 Years' War for the previous 8 decades. Catherine was approximately 19 years old at the time of her marriage, and the circumstances of her birth and upbringing had been shaped by the mental illness of her father, which had produced periods of complete incapacity in the French governance structure, and by the political chaos that had engulfed France during the conflict between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions. She had grown up in conditions of material insecurity and political instability that left permanent marks on her understanding of the fragility of royal position. Her marriage to Henry V was brief. Henry died in August 1422 at the age of 35, leaving Catherine a widow of 21 with an infant son, the future Henry VI, who was less than a year old. The political situation that Catherine faced as a dowager queen was constrained by the provisions made for the minority government and by the traditional English suspicion of foreign queens' influence over young kings, a suspicion that had been codified in legislation passed during Henry V's reign, restricting the remarriage of dowager queens without royal council approval. Catherine's subsequent life is one of the most remarkable in the entire Plantagenet story. She became involved with Owen Tudor, a Welsh gentleman of her household, and it appears that they were secretly married, though the precise date and circumstances of the marriage remain uncertain. The union, which produced at least 4 children, was kept concealed from the royal council for several years, and when it became known, it created a political problem of considerable magnitude. Since the Dowager Queen's remarriage without royal consent was a matter of legal sensitivity and potential dynastic complication, Owen Tudor was arrested following Catherine's death in 1437 and briefly imprisoned, though he was subsequently released and lived on for another 3 decades. The children of Catherine and Owen Tudor, and particularly their son Edmund Tudor, would eventually become the grandfather of Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty, through Edmund's marriage to Margaret Beaufort. Catherine of Valois thus occupied a position at the intersection of Plantagenet and Tudor history that gives her a significance extending far beyond her own brief and difficult life. She died in January 1437 at the age of approximately 35, having spent 14 years as a widow, managing her position with the combination of personal courage and practical resourcefulness that her circumstances demanded. The secret of her marriage to Owen Tudor, maintained for years against the social and legal pressures that surrounded it, represents an act of personal determination whose consequences for English dynastic history were entirely disproportionate to the apparent scale of the decision taken by a young widow seeking companionship and security in a politically precarious position. Margaret of Anjou, who became the wife of Henry VI in April 1445, at the age of approximately 15, represents in many respects the most dramatic example of female political agency in the entire Plantagenet period. She was the daughter of René of Anjou, whose claim to the kingdoms of Naples and Jerusalem was more substantial in title than in territorial reality, and her marriage to the Lancastrian king was negotiated by William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, as part of a diplomatic arrangement that included the cession of Maine and Anjou to the French crown, a concession so unpopular in England that it contributed directly to Suffolk's eventual murder by an English mob in 1450. The political environment into which Margaret arrived in England was already deeply unstable, marked by the final phases of the 100 Years' War, the loss of the Norman and Angevin territories in France, and the deepening factional divisions within the English baronage that would eventually produce the Wars of the Roses. Margaret arrived in England as a queen whose political education had been conducted in one of the most sophisticated courts in France, and whose intelligence and determination were evident from the beginning of her time at the English court. She rapidly recognized that Henry VI, whose piety and personal gentleness were genuine, but whose capacity for effective governance was minimal, required a wife who could do what he could not. She assumed a political role that went substantially beyond the conventional expectations of a medieval queen consort, organizing factional alignments at court, cultivating relationships with magnates whose support the Lancastrian cause required, and becoming, as the 1440s and 1450s advanced, the effective leader of the Lancastrian party in its struggle against the Yorkist challenge mounted by Richard, Duke of York, and his allies. The birth of Edward of Westminster in October 1453, Henry VI's only child, occurred in circumstances that made the prince's dynastic position immediately controversial. Henry VI suffered his first complete mental breakdown in August 1453, falling into a catatonic state from which he did not emerge for 17 months. And the timing of Edward's birth during the king's incapacity generated immediate speculation about the prince's paternity that the Yorkists encouraged, and that has never been entirely resolved by historical analysis. Margaret defended the legitimacy of her son with the ferocity of a political actor who understood that everything she had worked to build depended on his recognition as heir to the throne. The defense of her son's legitimacy was not merely a mother's instinct, but a political program of the first importance, since the Lancastrian claim to the throne rested entirely on the continuation of the direct male line through Henry VI, and any doubt about Edward of Westminster's paternity was simultaneously a challenge to the entire basis of Lancastrian governance. When the Protectorate under Richard of York ended with Henry's recovery in December 1454. Margaret moved aggressively to reassert Lancastrian control over the royal government and to remove the Yorkist lords from the positions of influence they had acquired during the Protectorate. The outbreak of open warfare between the Lancastrian and Yorkist factions at the First Battle of St. Albans in May 1455, in which Richard of York defeated a Lancastrian force and killed several of the Queen's principal supporters, marked the beginning of the Wars of the Roses in earnest, and the subsequent decade saw Margaret increasingly assume the position of military and political leader of the Lancastrian cause, as Henry VI's capacity for effective command proved consistently inadequate to the demands of the Siege conflict. Margaret's activity during the Wars of the Roses involved dimensions of political and military organisation that went far beyond anything previously attempted by an English queen consort. She negotiated with the Scottish Queen Mary of Guelders for military assistance in exchange for the cession of Berwick, organising a Scottish alliance that brought an army south to support the Lancastrian forces in 1461. She travelled to France to seek support from Louis XI, navigating the complex and often treacherous diplomacy of the French court with considerable skill. She maintained the coherence of the Lancastrian cause through periods of military disaster that would have destroyed a less determined political actor, including the crushing defeat at the Battle of Towton in March 1461, which sent her fleeing to Scotland with Henry and their young son and resulted in the proclamation of Edward IV as King of England. The years of Lancastrian exile that followed, during which Margaret operated from various locations in France and Scotland, while attempting to maintain the political and military organisation necessary for an eventual restoration, represent one of the most sustained examples of female political persistence in medieval European history. She faced the exile with a combination of diplomatic ingenuity, personal courage, and relentless energy that even her enemies acknowledged. The repeated journeys between Scotland, France, and various locations along the English border, undertaken in conditions of financial hardship and physical danger, reflect a determination to continue the struggle that exceeded what could reasonably be expected of any political actor in her position. The readeption of Henry VI in 1470, briefly restored by an alliance between Margaret, the Earl of Warwick, who had himself switched sides, and the French king, seemed to promise the restoration of Lancastrian rule, but the return of Edward IV in 1471 ended the experiment. At the Battle of Tewkesbury in May 1471, the Lancastrian army was decisively defeated, and Edward of Westminster, the prince for whom Margaret had spent 16 years fighting, was killed. Henry VI died in the Tower of London shortly afterward, almost certainly murdered. Margaret was captured, imprisoned, and eventually ransomed by Louis XI of France in 1476, returning to France where she died in 1482, impoverished and without political influence, having outlasted the cause she had devoted her life to sustaining by more than a decade. The scale of her determination, her organizational capacity, and her refusal to accept defeat place her among the most remarkable political figures of the Plantagenet era, regardless of the ultimate failure of her efforts. Elizabeth Woodville, who became the wife of Edward IV in a secret marriage in May 1464 that astonished the English political establishment and complicated the king's diplomacy at a critical moment, came from a background that was relatively modest by the standards of the women who had previously occupied the position of Queen of England. She was the widow of Sir John Grey, a Lancastrian knight who had been killed at the Second Battle of St. Albans in 1461, and her family, the Woodvilles, were of knightly rather than magnate rank. The marriage represented a rupture with convention that the Earl of Warwick, who had been negotiating a French marriage alliance for Edward, regarded as a personal humiliation and a political disaster, and the resentment it generated contributed to the Warwick Rebellion of 1469 and 1470 that temporarily displaced Edward from the throne. Elizabeth, pregnant when Warwick's forces moved against the king, took sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, where she gave birth to the future Edward V in November 1470, demonstrating in this first major crisis the capacity for survival under pressure that would characterize her entire political career. She emerged from sanctuary following Edward's restoration in 1471 and resumed her position as queen with the evident ability to manage the competing interests of her own large family and the comes of later, established nobility that her presence at court had permanently complicated. Elizabeth's political significance extended beyond her role as the mother of Edward IV's children, though that role was itself of paramount importance. She bore Edward 10 children, of whom 7 survived to adulthood, including 2 sons, Edward, Prince of Wales, and Richard, Duke of York, whose fate would become the most haunting mystery of the Plantagenet story. She was an active patron of cultural and religious institutions, including Queen's College at Cambridge, which she refounded in her role as queen and which preserves in its name the memory of her queenly status. The connections she maintained with the English merchant class and with the Flemish commercial networks that Edward IV cultivated reflected an understanding of the economic dimensions of royal power that was more sophisticated than the conventional image of a beautiful but politically naive woman who had trapped a king in marriage. When Edward IV died suddenly in April 1483, leaving a 12-year-old heir whose authority was immediately contested by Edward's brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Elizabeth's political skills were tested in ways that would ultimately exceed her capacity to respond effectively. She attempted to maintain the position of her son's supporters against the concentration of power in Richard's hands, retreating to sanctuary at Westminster with her children when it became clear that the political situation was developing in ways that threatened the Woodville family's position. She was persuaded or compelled to release her younger son, Richard, from sanctuary in June 1483, and both boys subsequently disappeared into the Tower of London, from which they never emerged. The fate of the princes in the Tower remains one of the most debated questions in English historical scholarship, and Elizabeth's acquiescence in arrangements that ultimately left her sons at Richard's mercy has been attributed to various combinations of coercion, political calculation, and the limited options available to a woman whose power base had been systematically dismantled by Richard's rapid consolidation of authority. The nature of that acquiescence, whether it represented genuine trust in Richard's assurances, a tactical calculation that continued resistance from sanctuary was impossible, or something else entirely, cannot be determined from the surviving evidence with the confidence that the question's emotional significance demands. Elizabeth Woodville's subsequent history reveals the extent to which her political position depended on the power of others. She eventually reached an accommodation with Richard III that allowed her to leave sanctuary in March 1484, apparently in exchange for Richard's formal promises regarding the welfare of her daughters and the provision of suitable marriages for them. The sincerity of this accommodation was questionable on both sides, and Elizabeth's role in the conspiracy that eventually brought Henry Tudor to the throne in 1485 remains a matter of scholarly debate. Her agreement to the marriage of her daughter Elizabeth of York to Henry Tudor, which was a cornerstone of the Tudor claim to unite the Lancastrian and Yorkist lines, was a decision of enormous dynastic significance that reflected both her political judgment and her understanding that the future of her family's position depended on the success of the Tudor enterprise. Following Henry VII's victory at Bosworth in August 1485, Elizabeth Woodville found herself the mother-in-law of a new king and the grandmother of children who would continue the royal line. But her own political position was not secure. In 1487, she was stripped of her lands and retired to Bermondsey Abbey, where she died in June 1492. The reasons for her effective removal from court in 1487 have been debated by historians, with some attributing it to her alleged involvement in the Lambert-Simnel conspiracy of that year, and others suggesting that Henry VII simply found her presence at court politically inconvenient and preferred to have his wife's mother in an institutional setting where her potential for mischief was limited. Whatever the precise cause, her end mirrors with uncomfortable precision the endings of several of her predecessors: removal from effective power, institutional confinement, and the reduction of influence to zero at a moment when the political landscape no longer required her participation. The life of Elizabeth Woodville spans the most turbulent decades of Plantagenet political history, and her survival through those decades as the wife of a Yorkist king who deposed a Lancastrian, as the mother of princes who disappeared, as the widow of one dynasty and the mother-in-law of the next, represents an achievement of personal and political resilience whose full significance only becomes apparent when the entire arc of her career is traced from beginning to end. Anne Neville, who became the wife of Richard III in 1472, deserves examination as a figure whose political significance has been largely subsumed into the controversy surrounding her husband's reign and the question of the princes in the Tower. Anne was the younger daughter of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker whose military and political organisation had been decisive in bringing Edward IV to the throne, and whose defection to the Lancastrian cause in 1470 had temporarily displaced him. Anne had been married as a child to Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian prince killed at Tewkesbury in 1471, and her subsequent marriage to Richard of Gloucester, which occurred despite the opposition of Richard's brother George, Duke of Clarence, who wished to control the Neville inheritance that Anne would bring to any husband, was achieved through a combination of Richard's determination and the legal mechanisms available to a powerful duke. Anne was the co-heiress of the Warwick estates, and her marriage to Richard was a property transaction as much as a personal relationship. The division of the Neville inheritance between Richard and Clarence, producing years of fraternal hostility that contributed to Clarence's eventual attainder and execution in 1478. Anne became the Queen in June 1483, when Richard took the throne, and she was crowned alongside him in an elaborate ceremony at Westminster Abbey in July of that year. The coronation of Richard and Anne was one of the most magnificent ceremonies of its kind in the Plantagenet period, conducted with a display of regal magnificence that was clearly intended to establish the legitimacy of a usurpation that large parts of the English political class regarded with suspicion or hostility. Anne's presence at the coronation and her formal crowning as queen provided the ceremony with a dimension of dynastic continuity. She was, through her Neville parentage, connected to the deepest roots of English noble power that helped anchor Richard's kingship to established political traditions. She bore Richard one son, Edward of Middleham, who died in April 1484 at the age of approximately 10, a loss that contemporaries noted had visibly devastated both parents. The death of Edward of Middleham eliminated the direct Ricardian succession and threw the question of Richard's dynastic future into uncertainty at precisely the moment when the external threat from Henry Tudor was beginning to crystallize into a credible military challenge. Anne herself died in March 1485, probably of tuberculosis, and the stories circulated by hostile sources that Richard had poisoned her to free himself for a marriage to his niece Elizabeth of York reflect the atmosphere of dynastic suspicion that surrounded Richard's reign rather than any evidential basis. Richard's reign ended at Bosworth in August 1485, and with it the direct Plantagenet line in its Yorkist manifestation. Margaret Beaufort, whose significance to the transition from Plantagenet to Tudor history is difficult to overstate, was the daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and a great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and Catherine Swynford. The Beaufort descent from Gaunt was through children born before the marriage of Gaunt and Catherine, subsequently legitimised by papal and parliamentary authority, but with an explicit exclusion from the royal succession added to the act of legitimation during the reign of Henry IV. Whether this exclusion was legally effective, and whether it could be set aside by a successful military usurpation, were questions that would eventually be resolved in practice rather than in theory by Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth. Margaret was born in 1443 and was married first in 1450 to John de la Pole, a marriage that was quickly annulled, and then in 1455 to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, who was the half-brother of Henry VI through his mother Catherine of Valois and Owen Tudor. Edmund Tudor died in November 1456, when Margaret was 13 years old and heavily pregnant, and she gave birth to the future Henry VII in January 1457 at Pembroke Castle, the delivery being sufficiently difficult that her physicians believed she was unlikely to survive it and that she was certainly rendered incapable of bearing further children. She was 13 years old, newly widowed, and had just given birth to the child who would eventually become King of England, a combination of circumstances whose physical and emotional demands on a young woman of medieval England can only be partially imagined from the distance of the present. Margaret Beaufort's life, from the birth of Henry Tudor in 1457 to his victory at Bosworth in 1485, was organised around the project of preserving and eventually advancing his dynastic claim. She remarried twice to Henry Stafford in 1459 and, following his death, to Thomas Stanley in 1472, and her successive marriages reflected the practical political judgment that her own security and her son's ultimate interests required her to maintain a position at the centre of English court life, rather than retreat into widowhood. Her relationship with Henry, who was removed from her custody for most of his childhood and adolescence, was maintained through correspondence and through the political networks she cultivated with Henry's guardians in Brittany and France, where he lived in exile for 14 years following the Yorkist consolidation of power. The sophistication of Margaret's political operation during the years of Yorkist supremacy, in which she simultaneously maintained a credible position at the Yorkist court while sustaining connections with those who might eventually support her son's claim, reflects a mastery of the art of political navigation under adverse conditions that places her among the most accomplished political operators of the Plantagenet period. Her participation in the Buckingham Rebellion of 1483, which aimed to place Henry Tudor on the throne following Richard III's usurpation, was discovered, and the punishment imposed on her attainder and the transfer of her property to her husband Thomas Stanley, who was politically reliable from Richard's perspective, reflected both the seriousness with which her involvement was taken and the limits of what could be done to a woman whose husband remained a powerful figure. She was placed under Stanley's supervision rather than imprisoned, and the relative mildness of her punishment, compared to what would have been visited on a male conspirator, reflected the gendered assumptions about female political agency that persisted even in the face of evidence of its reality. The fact that Margaret Beaufort remained at liberty, maintained her connections, and continued to work for her son's cause in the months between the failure of the Buckingham Rebellion in October 1483 and the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485, represents one of the more remarkable examples of political persistence under legal disability in the entire Plantagenet story. Thomas Stanley's switching of allegiance at the critical moment during the Battle of Bosworth, bringing his forces to Henry Tudor's side when the battle's outcome was still in the balance, was not unconnected to the political relationship his wife had cultivated with the Tudor cause over decades, and the role that Margaret's marriage to Stanley played in, eventually delivering Stanley's military support to her son, is an example of the indirect but real political effectiveness that the institution of marriage could provide to women who understood how to use it. Margaret Beaufort survived to see Henry Tudor crowned Henry VII in October 1485, following his victory at Bosworth, and her influence over the early Tudor court was substantial. She was one of the most learned women in England, a patron of learning who contributed to the foundation of Christ's College and St. John's College at Cambridge, a translator of devotional texts from French, and a figure whose intellectual interests and genuine piety gave her a cultural authority that complemented her political position. The college foundations she supported at Cambridge represent among the most durable legacies of any Plantagenet-connected woman, institutions that continue to exist and to educate students more than 500 years after her death. Her translation work brought devotional literature in the Flemish and French traditions into English, contributing to the development of English religious prose at a period when the intellectual life of the English Church was undergoing significant changes in response to the pressures of Lollardy and the early stirrings of the Reform, currents that would eventually produce the English Reformation. She outlived her son, dying in June 1509, just weeks after Henry VII's death. Having witnessed the accession of her grandson Henry VIII and the apparent security of the dynasty she had spent 50 years working to establish. Her role in the creation of the Tudor dynasty, from the materials of Plantagenet legitimacy, represents the final chapter of the long story of women's influence over the succession, governance, and cultural life of the dynasty that Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage had made possible nearly 4 centuries before Margaret's death. The women of the Plantagenet dynasty operated within institutional structures that were overwhelmingly designed to serve the interests and perpetuate the authority of men, and yet the historical record of those 3.5 centuries reveals with persistent clarity that the boundary between female exclusion and female power was far more permeable than the formal structures implied. The mechanisms through which women exercised political agency varied enormously through the direct governance of territories during husbands' absences, through the management of patronage networks that shaped the composition and character of court factions, through the transmission of dynastic claims that gave their children the legitimacy to contest thrones, through the organization of military and diplomatic resources during crises that male governance had failed to prevent, and through the cultural patronage that shaped the intellectual and aesthetic life of the Plantagenet court across centuries. None of these mechanisms operated in isolation from the others, and the most politically significant women of the period, Empress Matilda, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Margaret Beaufort, exercised their influence through multiple channels simultaneously, adapting their strategies to the political circumstances of specific moments while maintaining the long-term dynastic vision that gave their activities coherence and purpose. The question of how these women understood their own agency is one that the surviving historical record addresses only indirectly, since the documents that preserve their activities were overwhelmingly produced within frameworks of governance and legitimacy that assumed male authority as the norm and described female political action in terms that ranged from admiring acknowledgement to hostile condemnation. Empress Matilda's insistence on the title Domina Anglorum, rather than the Regina that contemporaries expected, suggests a woman navigating the gap between what she believed herself entitled to and what the political culture of her time would grant her. The choice of this particular title, Lady of the English, rather than Queen, was not a gesture of self-deprecation, but a calculated assertion of authority within the terms that the political situation made available, claiming the substance of governance while conceding the formal title whose use might have provoked additional resistance from those already resistant to accepting female rule. Eleanor of Aquitaine's retention of the title Duchess of Aquitaine throughout her life, her signing of documents in her own name, and her consistent identification with the governance traditions of her own duchy rather than those of her husband, suggest a woman who understood the territorial basis of her power with clarity and who maintained it as the foundation of her political identity through imprisonment, widowhood, and extreme old age. Margaret of Anjou's assumption of military command, her correspondence with foreign rulers on behalf of the Lancastrian cause, and her decades of determined resistance to the Yorkist displacement of her son suggest a woman who had reached the conclusion that the conventional limitations on queenly political activity were simply irrelevant to the crisis she faced, and that the survival of her dynastic project required her to act as rulers acted, whatever the formal categories might prescribe. The hostile characterizations of Margaret in Yorkist sources as unnatural, unwomanly, wolf-like, reflect precisely the gap between her actual conduct and the expectations that the conventional framework for queenly behavior imposed, and the vehemence of this hostility testifies to the effectiveness of her challenge to those expectations. Margaret Beaufort's combination of scholarly piety, political calculation, and determined maternal loyalty suggests a woman who had found in the project of her son's advancement a framework that gave coherent meaning to the exercise of political agency that would otherwise have lacked legitimate purpose. Within the institutional structures of her time, the identification of her own political ambitions with her son's dynastic claim provided Margaret with a form of legitimation that made her political activities comprehensible as maternal devotion rather than personal ambition, in terms that the culture of her period could accept, even as the actual sophistication and scale of those activities exceeded what the maternal devotion framework alone would have required. The legacy of these women extends beyond the specific political outcomes they achieved or failed to achieve. The cultural life of Plantagenet England was shaped by women's patronage in ways that the surviving artifacts make visible. Eleanor of Aquitaine's connections to troubadour culture, Anne of Bohemia's links to Bohemian intellectual life, Philippa of Hainault's support for Chaucer, Margaret Beaufort's patronage of Cambridge colleges and translation work of these contributions to the intellectual and cultural fabric of the period deserve recognition alongside the military and political activities that tend to dominate historical narrative, the commissioning of manuscripts, the foundation and support of religious institutions, the patronage of architects and craftsmen. All of these cultural activities involved women of the Plantagenet circle as patrons and organizers whose taste and resources shaped the material culture of the era in ways that can still be traced in surviving buildings, books, and objects. The tombs at Fontevraud, where Eleanor of Aquitaine lies beside Henry II and Richard I, provide the most visually immediate testimony to the centrality of women within the Plantagenet story, and the remarkable stone effigy of Eleanor herself, showing her with a book in her hands, an object associated with the intellectual life that her patronage and personal engagement sustained, constitutes an image that challenges with particular force any understanding of medieval queenship as primarily passive or decorative. The transition from Plantagenet to Tudor in 1485 was achieved through a combination of military victory, dynastic marriage, and political legitimation that drew on the labour of several generations of women whose efforts made Henry Tudor's claim credible and his victory possible. Catherine of Valois provided the biological connection between the royal family and the Tudor line through her secret marriage to Owen Tudor and the children that marriage produced. Margaret Beaufort organised and sustained the political enterprise that eventually bore fruit at Bosworth through decades of careful cultivation of alliances, maintenance of diplomatic connections, and willingness to take political risks at moments when caution would have been easier and safer. Elizabeth Woodville negotiated the marriage alliance that united the Lancastrian and Yorkist claims in the person of Elizabeth of York, who became Henry VII's queen, and whose children would inherit a unified claim to the English throne that drew on both sides of the dynastic conflict that had shaped the preceding 3 decades. The Tudor dynasty that these women helped to create would go on to transform England's religious, cultural, and political character in ways that neither they nor their contemporaries could have anticipated. But the immediate achievement, the survival of a Plantagenet-descended dynasty through 3.5 centuries of dynastic conflict, civil war, plague, military catastrophe, and institutional crisis, was built on foundations that the women of that dynasty had laid, maintained, and repeatedly restored when the men who nominally controlled it had failed to preserve it. The persistence of the Plantagenet line from Henry II to Richard III and the transmission of its legacy through the maternal connections that produced Henry VII represents not merely a political achievement, but a demonstration of what women's political agency, exercised across generations and through the limited but real channels available to it, could accomplish within the most demanding institutional constraints that medieval European civilization imposed. The detailed examination of individual lives that this account has attempted to provide reveals a pattern that transcends any single biography and constitutes a structural feature of Plantagenet dynastic history. The women of the dynasty were not passive vessels for dynastic transmission, but active agents whose decisions, alliances, diplomatic efforts, and cultural patronage shaped the character of the dynasty across every generation of its existence. Empress Matilda created the dynasty through her marriage and her wars. Eleanor of Aquitaine gave it its continental character and its extraordinary cultural vitality. Isabella of France saved it from the dysfunction of Edward II's reign by deposing him and securing the succession for Edward III. Margaret of Anjou sustained the Lancastrian line through 2 decades of military and political crisis before the resources available to her were finally exhausted. Margaret Beaufort engineered the dynastic resolution that transferred the Plantagenet inheritance to the Tudor line. Each of these women acted within the constraints of their historical moment, and each left marks on the dynasty that are visible in the historical record with sufficient clarity to support analysis and to demand recognition. The full scope of the Plantagenet story cannot be understood through the lives of its kings alone. The dynasty's survival through the extraordinary pressures of the 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, its cultural achievements, its legal and institutional innovations, and its ultimate transmission into the Tudor era were products of the combined efforts of women and men whose contributions were complementary rather than hierarchical, even when the formal structures of governance insisted otherwise. To read the history of the Plantagenet dynasty with full attention to the evidence of women's agency is not to impose modern concerns on a medieval past, but to restore to the historical record the complexity that was always there, that the long preference for narrative, centered on kings, had persistently obscured. The women who shaped the Plantagenet dynasty shaped England itself, and the kingdom that emerged from those 3.5 centuries of extraordinary turbulence and achievement bore the marks of their influence in ways that no account centered solely on its male rulers can adequately explain or illuminate. The story of these women is the story of the dynasty, and the dynasty is inseparable from the women who built, sustained, contested, and ultimately transmitted it across the centuries that defined the foundations of the English state. The institutional frameworks within which Plantagenet women operated were not static across the 3.5 centuries of the dynasty's existence, and an understanding of how those frameworks evolved is essential to appreciating both the constraints women faced and the specific forms their agency took at different moments in the dynastic story. The queenship of the 12th century was a different institution from the queenship of the 15th, and the differences between them reflected broader changes in the organization of the English royal government, the development of parliamentary institutions, the growth of the common law, and the transformations in the ideological frameworks through which political authority was justified and contested. In the early Plantagenet period, when the royal household remained the primary instrument of governance, and the personal relationships between the king and his immediate circle determined the direction of policy, the Queen's proximity to power was structural rather than exceptional. She was necessarily present at the center of the household, necessarily involved in the management of its affairs, necessarily in contact with the principal figures of the realm who passed through its orbit. The opportunities for political influence that this proximity created were real, even when they were not formalized in any institutional sense, and the most politically capable women of the early Plantagenet period, Eleanor of Aquitaine, above all exploited them with a sophistication that the formal structures of governance did not require and could not easily prevent. The development of the royal administration through the course of the 13th century, as the Exchequer and the Chancery became more fully differentiated institutional entities operating through their own professional staffs and their own administrative procedures, gradually separated the formal mechanisms of governance from the personal household environment in which queens naturally operated. This separation did not eliminate queenly influence, but it changed its character, making it more dependent on the cultivation of relationships with specific ministers and officials, and less dependent on the direct management of the king's personal environment. Eleanor of Castile's active management of her own lands and finances, which generated the baronial resentment that found expression in the Parliament of 1290, reflected her adaptation to this changed administrative landscape, in which the accumulation of independent economic resources was a more reliable foundation for political influence than the immediate personal access that the integrated household of the early Plantagenet period had provided. The queen, who could not control the king's immediate household, could at least control her own estates, and the management of those estates required the kind of administrative expertise that Eleanor of Castile clearly possessed and exercised. The growth of parliamentary institutions during the 13th and 14th centuries created new forums for political negotiation, and new mechanisms for expressing baronial and, eventually, broader communal grievances against the exercise of royal authority. The role of women in these new institutional spaces was marginal in formal terms. Queens did not sit in parliaments, did not participate in the debates of the Common Council, and did not formally subscribe to the agreements between Crown and baronage that parliamentary sessions increasingly produced. But the informal influence that women exercised on the political process that produced parliamentary outcomes was not negligible. Eleanor of Provence's diplomatic activities during the crisis of the Barons' War operated at the interface between the formal parliamentary politics of the English baronage and the continental diplomatic world to which she had access through her family connections, and her ability to move between these two political spaces gave her a flexibility that few English political actors of her time possessed. Isabella of France's organisation of the invasion of 1226 operated outside parliamentary forms entirely, but its success was facilitated by the networks of baronial support that she had cultivated through years of careful attention to the factional politics of the English court, and the parliament that subsequently ratified Edward III's title was the formal conclusion of a political process that she had set in motion. The relationship between women's political activity and the formal institutional structures of Plantagenet governance was consistently one of influence operating through informal channels upon formal processes whose outcomes it shaped, without formally controlling. The Black Death of 1348 to 1350, which killed approximately a third of the population of England in its initial outbreak and continued to return in successive waves throughout the second half of the 14th century, transformed the social and economic landscape of Plantagenet England in ways that affected the position of women as profoundly as any strictly political development of the period. The dramatic reduction in population created labour shortages that disrupted the traditional economic arrangements of the manorial system and generated upward pressure on wages and conditions for the surviving labouring population, while simultaneously creating opportunities for social mobility that the more stable conditions of the earlier medieval period had not offered. The implications of these changes for women of the aristocratic and royal classes were complex and varied. The disruption of established social hierarchies created by the plague's indiscriminate mortality, which killed bishops and barons as readily as it killed serfs, temporarily loosened some of the conventions that had governed the management of noble women's lives, while the long-term economic consequences of depopulation altered the landed wealth calculations on which marriage strategies were based. The political instability that characterized the second half of the 14th century, the domination of Edward III's court in his decline, the troubled reign of Richard II, the Lancastrian usurpation, and the eventual outbreak of the Wars of the Roses created the conditions within which women like Margaret of Anjou and Margaret Beaufort found both the necessity and the opportunity to exercise the kind of political agency that more stable times might not have required or permitted. The development of English common law through the Plantagenet period created a legal framework for women's property rights and contractual capacities that was both less favourable to female agency than the customary arrangements it gradually replaced. The common law concept of coverture, which subsumed a married woman's legal identity into that of her husband and eliminated her capacity to hold property, make contracts, or sue in her own name during marriage, was in some respects a hardening of restrictions that customary practice had already imposed, but the rigidity with which it was applied by common law courts represented a deterioration in the legal position of married women compared to the more flexible arrangements of earlier periods. Widows, by contrast, enjoyed full common law capacity and could hold property, make contracts, and litigate in their own names, which explains why the political activities of Plantagenet queens were frequently most extensive and most visible during their widowhoods. Eleanor of Aquitaine after Henry II's death, Isabella of France after Edward II's deposition and murder, Margaret Beaufort through the series of carefully managed widowhoods and remarriages that sustained her political position throughout the Yorkist period. The legal framework of widowhood provided a formal basis for the exercise of political agency that the legal framework of marriage denied, and the women who were most effective political actors in the Plantagenet period were those who understood how to maintain the substance of political engagement through the formal constraints that their legal status imposed at different stages of their lives. The relationship between religion and female political agency in the Plantagenet period was complex and bidirectional, operating both as a constraint on women's public activities through the consistent association of female public action with departures from the divinely ordained order, and as a resource that women could deploy in support of their political projects. The Church provided women with access to networks of communication and patronage that operated independently of the secular political structures from which they were formally excluded, and the cultivation of relationships with bishops, abbots, and papal representatives gave politically active queens channels of information and influence that their male contemporaries could not easily control or monitor. Eleanor of Aquitaine's correspondence with Pope Alexander III during the Becket controversy and in her later years, Eleanor of Provence's relationships with the papal curia that gave her channels of communication during the Barons' War, and Margaret Beaufort's integration of her political activities with her genuine piety and her patronage of religious institutions all reflect the strategic as well as devotional dimensions of royal women's engagement with the institutional church. The monasteries and convents that provided retirement locations for politically active queens, Amesbury for Eleanor of Provence, Bermondsey for Elizabeth Woodville, were not merely residences of convenience, but institutions with their own political significance, connected to networks of influence and patronage that extended well beyond their physical walls. The patronage of scholarship and learning that several Plantagenet queens undertook during the 12th through 15th centuries represents a dimension of female political agency that operated through the mechanisms of cultural production rather than the mechanisms of administrative governance, and that has sometimes been treated as less significant than the more conventionally political activities with which it coexisted. This treatment is mistaken. The cultural productions that royal patronage made possible, the manuscripts illuminated for Eleanor of Aquitaine, the literary works whose composition was encouraged by Philippa of Hainault's household, the college foundations of Margaret Beaufort were not merely aesthetic achievements, but instruments of political legitimation, cultural communication, and intellectual influence whose effects extended across generations and across social boundaries in ways that more directly political activities could not achieve. The construction of a particular image of queenship through literary representation, hagiographic writing, and commemorative art was a political project in the fullest sense of the term, and the women who commissioned and shaped these cultural productions were exercising a form of political agency that the exclusively political focus of most historical narrative has consistently undervalued. The tomb effigy of Eleanor of Castile at Westminster Abbey, the Eleanor crosses that transformed the English landscape, the portraits of Margaret Beaufort that preserved her image for subsequent generations. All of these cultural artifacts are products of political projects in which the women themselves were active participants, and their survival testifies to the effectiveness with which those projects were executed. The management of royal marriages as instruments of diplomatic policy was a dimension of Plantagenet governance in which women played a role that was simultaneously central and constrained in distinctive ways. The marriages of royal daughters to foreign rulers extended the diplomatic reach of the English crown across Europe, and the management of these alliances, the negotiation of dowry terms, the cultivation of relationships with foreign courts, the maintenance of communication between England and the courts into which English princesses had been married, required sustained attention that fell substantially to the Queen and to the networks she maintained through her own family connections. Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughters, Eleanor and Joan, whose marriages to the kings of Castile and Sicily respectively served the diplomatic purposes of the Plantagenet Empire, maintained relationships with their mother that provided channels of communication between the English crown and two of the most important kingdoms of the Iberian and Italian worlds. The management of these relationships, which required Eleanor to maintain simultaneous diplomatic contacts across a geographical range extending from Santiago de Compostela to Palermo, was an administrative achievement of considerable complexity that the surviving correspondence only partially illuminates. Similarly, the daughters of Edward I, whose marriages to rulers in the Low Countries, the Iberian Peninsula, and Scotland served his diplomatic strategies in different directions, simultaneously required the kind of sustained managerial attention that the Queen's household was best positioned to provide. The specific contributions of women to the legal and constitutional innovations that characterize the Plantagenet period have received less attention than their political activities, but they are not without significance. Magna Carta, agreed in 1215 between King John and the barons, contained specific provisions regarding the treatment of widows and their rights to their dower properties and to freedom of remarriage, provisions that reflected the real concerns of the baronial class, whose female members were regularly subject to the pressures of royal manipulation of wardship and marriage rights. The inclusion of these provisions in the foundational constitutional document of English governance reflects the degree to which women's property rights and personal freedoms were understood as matters of legitimate public concern, rather than merely private family arrangements, and the subsequent incorporation of these provisions into successive reissues of Magna Carta ensured that they became part of the permanent constitutional inheritance of the common law. Eleanor of Castile's exploitation of wardship and property rights in ways that the Parliament of 1290 found objectionable was itself a response to the same legal framework that Magna Carta had begun to define, and the tension between the legal protections the Charter afforded and the actual exercise of royal prerogative in relation to women's property was a persistent feature of Plantagenet political life that generated both legal and political controversy throughout the period. The Welsh and Scottish dimensions of Plantagenet governance created specific contexts within which women's political significance manifested in distinctive ways. The conquest and pacification of Wales, completed under Edward I in the years following 1277, and the management of the political integration of the Welsh territories into the English Crown's administrative structure, involved the deployment of women in diplomatic and cultural roles that the specifically Welsh context required. Joan of England, the illegitimate daughter of King John who became the wife of Llywelyn the Great, Prince of Gwynedd, around 1206, served as a crucial diplomatic intermediary between the English crown and the most powerful Welsh ruler of the early 13th century, and the management of this relationship, which required Joan to navigate the competing loyalties to her father's kingdom and her husband's principality, illustrates the specific forms that female political agency took at the frontiers of Plantagenet power, where the normal conventions of English court politics did not straightforwardly apply. The management of Scottish relations through the strategic deployment of royal marriages was similarly a dimension of Plantagenet policy in which women served both as instruments of diplomatic strategy and as independent actors whose responses to the political situations they found themselves in shaped the outcomes of those strategies in ways that the men who designed them could not fully control. The experience of crusade and pilgrimage, which took a significant number of Plantagenet queens and noblewomen out of the familiar environments of the English court and into the politically and physically demanding contexts of the Eastern Mediterranean and the pilgrimage routes of Europe, created specific opportunities and specific vulnerabilities for the women involved. Eleanor of Aquitaine's accompaniment of Louis VII on the Second Crusade has already been discussed, but the pattern she established of royal women accompanying their husbands on military and religious ventures to distant territories continued through subsequent generations of the Plantagenet period. Berengaria of Navarre, Richard I's wife, travelled to the eastern Mediterranean to marry Richard in Cyprus in 1191 and subsequently accompanied him through the Palestinian campaign, experiencing the combination of physical hardship, political uncertainty, and cultural displacement that characterized the crusading experience for the women who participated in it. Her subsequent separation from Richard, whose extended campaigning and eventual imprisonment left her effectively alone in the Plantagenet territories for years at a time, and her difficult negotiations for her dower rights after Richard's death, illustrate the specific vulnerabilities that the crusading enterprise created for royal women whose husbands' long absences and eventual deaths left them in legally and politically precarious positions. The cultural exchange, facilitated by the movement of Plantagenet women between England and the continent through marriage, through crusade, through pilgrimage, through political exile, was one of the mechanisms through which the English court was integrated into the broader intellectual life of medieval Europe during the Plantagenet period. Eleanor of Aquitaine brought the troubadour tradition northward. Anne of Bohemia brought connections to Central European intellectual culture. The Provençal relatives of Eleanor of Provence brought the cultural traditions of the southern French courts. These cultural introductions were not merely decorative additions to the life of an otherwise unaffected court, but genuine intellectual exchanges that altered the character of English court culture in ways whose effects can be traced in the surviving literary, artistic, and architectural productions of successive generations. The English vernacular literary tradition that produced Chaucer and Langland in the second half of the 14th century was the product of a long process of cultural accumulation in which the contributions of queens and noble women as patrons and consumers of literary production played a constitutive role, even when that role is not directly visible in the surviving texts. The question of how Plantagenet women are remembered in the historiographical tradition, how they have been characterized, evaluated, and sometimes celebrated or condemned by successive generations of historians, is itself a subject of considerable interest that illuminates both the historical realities of their lives and the changing frameworks within which those lives have been interpreted. The medieval chronicles that provide much of the primary evidence for the activities of Plantagenet queens were overwhelmingly written by male clerics, whose assumptions about the proper role of women in political life shaped both what they chose to record and how they chose to characterize it. Women who conformed to the model of the pious, charitable, and politically restrained queen consort received favorable treatment in the chronicles. Women who departed from that model, who organized rebellions, commanded armies, pursued independent political agendas, or associated themselves with controversial men, received characterizations that ranged from disapproving to actively hostile. Eleanor of Aquitaine's reputation in the chronicles of the 12th century reflects the consistent tension between the admiration to her extraordinary capabilities commanded and the discomfort that those capabilities, deployed in ways that challenged conventional expectations of queenly behavior, generated in contemporaries who could not reconcile her activities with their models of proper female conduct. Isabella of France's reputation in the chronicles of the 14th century reflects an even more extreme version of the same tension, with the hostile sources characterizing her in terms drawn from the tradition of the wicked queen, sexually voracious, politically scheming, destructive of the order she was supposed to sustain. That was one of the primary cultural frameworks through which medieval writers made sense of powerful women who had defied the expectations of their role. The recovery of a more nuanced historical understanding of Plantagenet women has been a gradual process that accelerated significantly in the 20th century, as historians began to apply the methods of women's history and gender history to the medieval period. The identification and analysis of administrative records, financial accounts, correspondence, legal documents that document women's economic and political activities outside the framework imposed by the chronicles has been particularly productive, making visible dimensions of female agency that the literary sources had obscured or misrepresented. The household accounts of Eleanor of Castile, the administrative records of Eleanor of Provence management of her dower lands, the correspondence of Margaret Beaufort with lawyers and administrators, the financial documents relating to Elizabeth Woodville's property transactions. All of these sources provide evidence of women's active participation in the administrative and economic life of the Plantagenet period that the chronicle tradition systematically underrepresented. The integration of this documentary evidence with the literary and chronicle sources has produced, over the past several decades, a substantially richer and more accurate picture of Plantagenet women's lives and agency than was available to earlier generations of scholars. The physical geography of Plantagenet England, its castles, its abbeys, its royal manors and hunting lodges, its pilgrimage churches preserves in its surviving fabric traces of the activities and patronage of the women whose lives this account has attempted to reconstruct. Westminster Abbey, substantially rebuilt under Henry III and completed through subsequent reigns, contains in its royal tombs the physical remains of several Plantagenet queens, including Eleanor of Castile, whose effigy represents one of the finest examples of 13th century English royal portraiture. The Eleanor crosses, which marked the route of Eleanor of Castile's funeral cortege from Nottinghamshire to London, represented a permanent transformation of the English landscape in memory of a queen, and while most of the original crosses have been destroyed by the passage of time and the deliberate interventions of later centuries, the sites they marked remain identifiable, and their historical significance remains acknowledged. Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou, where Eleanor of Aquitaine is buried alongside Henry II and Richard I, preserves in its church the most remarkable ensemble of royal funerary sculpture from the Angevin period. The polychrome effigies of Eleanor and her companions, representing a direct physical connection to the world in which the Plantagenet dynasty was created and to the woman whose political career had made it possible. The names given to English places, institutions, and cultural traditions preserve in their etymology the accumulated memory of Plantagenet women's presence and patronage. Queen's College at Cambridge, refounded by Elizabeth Woodville and subsequently by Margaret of Anjou, bears in its grammatically ambiguous possessive apostrophe the memory of both queens. The Eleanor crosses give their name to Charing Cross, a name known to millions of Londoners and visitors to London who have no knowledge of the woman whose funeral cortege rested there in the winter of 1290. The Abbey of Amesbury in Wiltshire, where Eleanor of Provence spent her final years as a nun, preserves the memory of a queen's retirement in a form that the landscape itself continues to carry. These survivals, however partial and however far removed from their original contexts, testify to the depth of the impression that Plantagenet women left on the physical and cultural world of medieval England, and to the persistence with which that impression has maintained itself through subsequent centuries of change and loss. The relationship between the women of the Plantagenet dynasty and the women of the broader English society they governed was mediated through a complex set of institutional and cultural mechanisms that included the church, the law, the manorial economy, and the varied spaces of urban commercial life that were expanding through the Plantagenet centuries. Queens and noble women served as models, positive and negative, aspirational and cautionary, whose conduct was observed, discussed, and interpreted by women at every level of English society, and the specific forms that this observational relationship took varied enormously depending on the social position of the observer and the particular circumstances of the queen or noblewoman whose conduct was under consideration. The queenly intercession that contemporaries celebrated in Philippa of Hainault, the willingness to plead with a powerful husband for mercy toward the vulnerable and the defeated, was a model of gendered political behavior that was simultaneously a constraint on female power and an exercise of it, channeling women's political agency into a specifically feminine mode of operation that was culturally valorized precisely because it confirmed, rather than challenged, the fundamental assumptions about the proper relationship between male authority and female influence. The queens who conformed most completely to this model, Philippa of Hainault, perhaps, or Anne of Bohemia, were the queens whose reputations survived most fully intact in the chronicles and in the subsequent historiographical tradition, while the queens who departed most dramatically from it, Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, attracted the most hostile characterizations and the most persistent controversies. The medical and reproductive dimensions of queenly experience, which modern historians have increasingly recognized as important contexts for understanding the political lives of medieval queens, were for the women of the Plantagenet dynasty both personal realities of sometimes extreme physical difficulty and political matters of the first importance. The production of male heirs was the primary dynastic obligation of a medieval queen, and the failure to produce them through infertility, through the death of children in infancy, through the accidents of demography, created political vulnerabilities that could fundamentally alter the queen's position at court and in the dynasty. Eleanor of Aquitaine's failure to produce male heirs for Louis VII contributed to the dissolution of their marriage. The absence of children from Richard I's marriage to Berengaria left the question of the succession to the throne unresolved throughout his reign and contributed to the succession crisis following his death. The birth of a single male heir to Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, in circumstances that left his paternity politically contested, created the specific dynastic vulnerability that the Yorkist challenge exploited with such devastating effectiveness. The deaths of children Matilda of England to Henry I, various children to Eleanor of Castile, Edward of Middleham to Anne Neville represented losses whose personal dimensions were real and whose political consequences were sometimes equally significant. The physical toll of repeated pregnancy and childbirth, which killed Margaret Beaufort's capacity for further reproduction at the age of 13, contributed to the deaths of several women in this account, and which subjected the survivors to decades of physical risk, was a dimension of queenly experience that no account of Plantagenet women's political activities can afford to ignore. The question of what motivated the most politically active women of the Plantagenet period, what combination of personal ambition, dynastic loyalty, maternal devotion, ideological conviction, and practical self-interest drove their sometimes extraordinary activities, is one that the surviving evidence can illuminate only partially. The motivational frameworks that medieval people used to explain their own actions, preserved in the correspondence, the chronicles, and the legal documents of the period, were shaped by the cultural and ideological assumptions of their time in ways that make their transparent use as evidence for individual psychological reality problematic. Margaret of Anjou explained her political activities as the defence of her son's legitimate inheritance and the protection of the Lancastrian crown against treasonous rebellion. Margaret Beaufort presented her dedication to her son's cause as maternal devotion and the exercise of her dynastic obligation to the blood of Lancaster. Eleanor of Aquitaine's activities during the rebellion of 1173 were explained by her contemporaries in terms of wifely treachery and sexual jealousy. None of these explanatory frameworks is entirely adequate to the complexity of the motivations they purport to describe, and the modern historian who attempts to recover those motivations must negotiate between the inadequacy of the available evidence and the temptation to impose contemporary psychological categories on a medieval past that operated within fundamentally different frameworks of self-understanding. What can be said with confidence is that the women who shaped the Plantagenet dynasty shared, across the enormous diversity of their individual circumstances, a common orientation toward the exercise of the capabilities available to them within the constraints of their specific historical situations. They were not revolutionaries seeking to overturn the gender order of their time, nor were they passive instruments of a dynastic logic that operated without their active participation. They were, in the most fundamental sense, political actors who understood the nature and limits of the power available to them, and who deployed that power with the intelligence, the determination, and the pragmatic adaptability that effective political action requires in any historical context. The dynasty they shaped was not the product of royal will alone, but of the combined efforts of generations of women whose contributions, for too long inadequately recognized in the historical narrative, deserve to be acknowledged with the same seriousness and the same analytical attention that the contributions of the kings, alongside whom they worked, have consistently received. The enduring significance of the Plantagenet dynasty's women lies not merely in the specific political outcomes their activities produced: the creation of the dynasty through Matilda's marriage, the preservation of the realm through Eleanor's regencies, the restoration of royal authority through Isabella's deposition of her husband, the survival of the Lancastrian cause through Margaret's decades of resistance, the transition to the Tudor dynasty through Margaret Beaufort's political engineering, but in what their activities collectively reveal about the nature of medieval political agency and the ways in which it operated across formal boundaries of gender that medieval institutions erected. The formal structures of Plantagenet governance were designed by men, administered predominantly by men, and theoretically justified through frameworks that assumed male authority as the natural and divinely ordained basis of political order. And yet those structures consistently proved insufficient to contain the political capabilities of women who were willing and able to deploy the resources available to them: territorial wealth, familial connections, diplomatic skill, cultural patronage, physical courage, and the sheer force of sustained political will in pursuit of the dynastic and personal objectives that motivated them. The gap between the formal exclusion of women from Plantagenet governance and the actual participation of women in Plantagenet politics is one of the most instructive features of the entire dynastic story, and the women whose lives this account has traced are its most vivid illustration. 3 centuries and more separate the birth of Empress Matilda from the death of Margaret Beaufort, and across those centuries, the specific forms of women's political agency change substantially in response to changes in the institutional structures of English governance, in the cultural frameworks within which political action was evaluated and justified, and in the specific dynastic circumstances that created particular opportunities and imposed particular constraints. What remained constant was the capacity of women who found themselves at the intersection of dynastic necessity and personal determination to make themselves into political actors of genuine consequence, operating through whatever channels the specific circumstances of their time and position made available, and leaving marks on the history of the dynasty and the kingdom that no account centered solely on the kings of England can adequately represent. The women of the Plantagenet dynasty shaped England's history as surely as the men who wore its crown, and the full recognition of that shaping influence is not the completion of the Plantagenet story, but its enrichment, restoring to one of the most consequential periods in English history the human complexity and the genuine drama that a partial narrative had inevitably suppressed. The specific role of women in the military dimensions of Plantagenet governance has been discussed in relation to the most dramatic examples: Isabella of France organizing an invasion fleet, Margaret of Anjou commanding Lancastrian forces in the field, but the military relevance of women's activities extended into less spectacular but equally significant domains that the historiographical emphasis on battle and siege has tended to obscure. The management of castle garrisons during sieges conducted in the absence of their male lords was a responsibility that fell to women of the noble class throughout the Plantagenet period, and the historical record preserves several instances of women who exercised this responsibility with considerable effectiveness. Nicola de la Haye, who served as Castellan of Lincoln Castle in her own right, and who held it against attack during the Barons' War of 1173 and 1174, and who repeated this service at the more extended siege of Lincoln in 1217, represents one of the most clearly documented examples of a woman exercising military command in Plantagenet England. Her conduct at Lincoln in 1217, during the battle that effectively ended the threat of French domination of England during Henry III's minority, earned her recognition from the royalist forces and demonstrated that the management of fortified positions was a capability that women of the appropriate social position and personal determination could exercise effectively within the pose. Military culture of the period. The survival of Lincoln Castle against sustained military pressure in 1217 was not a minor achievement, and the role of Nicola de la Haye in that survival constitutes a genuine military contribution to the preservation of Plantagenet rule that deserves to be acknowledged alongside the more frequently discussed martial exploits of male commanders. The economic sophistication that the more capable Plantagenet queens brought to the management of their financial affairs reflects the broader growth of commercial and financial complexity that characterized English society through the 12th to 15th centuries. The expansion of the money economy, the development of credit instruments, the growth of the wool trade and its connections to continental financial networks, and the increasing sophistication of the London merchant community all created an economic environment in which the management of significant financial resources required a degree of expertise that the most politically active queens clearly possessed. The household accounts of Eleanor of Castile, which survive in unusually complete form for the period from 1278 to 1290, document a financial operation of considerable complexity involving the management of multiple income streams from diverse sources, the coordination of purchasing arrangements across England and the continent, and the maintenance of a staff of administrators and servants whose costs were carefully controlled in relation to the revenues available. The sophistication of these financial operations reflects an understanding of the economic dimensions of royal status that is more characteristic of a professional estate manager than of the idealized image of the charitable and otherworldly queen that literary and hagiographic sources preferred to project. Margaret Beaufort's financial management in the later Plantagenet period shows a similar sophistication. Her careful cultivation of legal expertise and her systematic attention to the documentation of property rights, reflecting the lessons that decades of navigating the treacherous waters of Yorkist court politics had taught her about the importance of securing her financial position against the political vicissitudes that could otherwise destroy it. The diplomatic activities of Plantagenet women extended beyond the most visible episodes. Eleanor of Aquitaine's negotiations with the papacy, Margaret Beaufort's correspondence with Henry Tudor's supporters in Brittany, into the continuous management of the relationships between the English crown and the foreign powers with which it maintained ongoing diplomatic contact. The maintenance of these relationships required sustained attention to the cultivation of personal connections, the exchange of gifts and correspondence, and the demonstration of the kind of ongoing interest in foreign courts affairs that effective diplomacy requires. Queens were particularly well placed to exercise this function because their own family connections to foreign royal houses gave them personal relationships with foreign rulers and their courts that the English crown's official, diplomatic representatives lacked. The information that flowed through these personal networks about political conditions in France, the intentions of the papacy, the military capabilities of potential allies or enemies, was genuinely valuable to the conduct of English foreign policy, and the women who maintained these networks provided the crown with a dimension of diplomatic intelligence that the formal diplomatic apparatus could not easily replicate. The importance of this intelligence function in the overall diplomatic activity of the Plantagenet crown is difficult to quantify precisely, but the frequency with which it appears in the historical record, Eleanor of Provence's contacts with her Savoyard relatives, Eleanor of Castile's connections to the Castilian and French courts, Isabella of France's relationships with her Capetian brothers, suggests that it was a regular and significant component of the diplomatic intelligence available to the English crown throughout the Plantagenet period. The relationship between Plantagenet women and the Jewish communities of medieval England deserves specific attention, not only because of the general historical importance of the English Jewish community and its eventual expulsion under Edward I in 1290, but because the financial relationships between royal women and Jewish lenders and financiers represented one of the specific channels through which queens engaged with the commercial economy of Plantagenet England. Eleanor of Castile's use of Jewish financial intermediaries in the management of some of her property transactions, which was among the activities criticised by the Parliament of 1290, reflects the broader pattern of Jewish financial involvement in the English aristocratic economy that was a prominent feature of life in the 12th and 13th centuries, before the Jewish community's situation was progressively constrained by a combination of royal financial exploitation, ecclesiastical pressure, popular hostility, and the eventual expulsion decree. The expulsion itself, issued by Edward I in the same year as Eleanor's death, has sometimes been connected to the financial pressures that the royal household's indebtedness to Jewish lenders created. But the specific relationship between Eleanor's financial activities and the broader political decision to expel the Jewish community is a complex historiographical question that the available evidence does not resolve conclusively. What is clear is that the financial activities of Plantagenet queens were embedded in the broader economic world of medieval England in ways that included engagement with the Jewish community as financial intermediaries, and that this engagement was part of the economic reality of royal life in a way that has not always been acknowledged in accounts that present queens' financial activities in isolation from the commercial context within which they operated. The contribution of Plantagenet women to the development of English educational institutions is best documented in the case of Margaret Beaufort, whose foundations at Cambridge constitute the most substantial and most durable legacy of any single woman in the Plantagenet period. but the broader pattern of educational patronage by queens and noble women extended across the entire span of the dynasty. The support of cathedral schools, the funding of scholars pursuing theological and philosophical studies, the commissioning of translations, and the provision of books to religious institutions. All of these activities contributed to the maintenance and development of the educational infrastructure of medieval England in ways whose cumulative significance was considerable even when individual examples appear modest. The culture of book ownership and reading that was increasingly characteristic of educated women of the noble class through the later Plantagenet period, visible in the inventories of Queen's possessions, in the dedications of literary works to female patrons, and in the occasional direct evidence of women's reading habits preserved in marginalia and ownership inscriptions, reflects a relationship with written culture that went beyond mere passive consumption to encompass active participation in the literary and intellectual life of the period. Margaret Beaufort's translation work, Eleanor of Aquitaine's patronage of vernacular literary production, and the various queens who commissioned illuminated devotional manuscripts were engaged in cultural production as much as cultural consumption, and the distinction between patron and creator was, in practice, considerably less sharp than the formal attribution of authorship to male writers and scholars might suggest. The question of literacy and education among Plantagenet women is itself a complex historical problem whose resolution requires careful attention to the specific types of literacy involved and the specific contexts in which they were deployed. Latin literacy, which was the primary medium of formal administrative, legal, and theological culture throughout the Plantagenet period, was considerably less common among women than among the male clerical class that staffed the royal administration, but it was not entirely absent from the upper levels of the female aristocracy, and the ability to read and write in the vernacular languages, French, and, increasingly through the later Plantagenet period, English was more widespread than Latin literacy and provided access to a substantial body of literary, devotional, and practical written material that was relevant to women's lives and interests. Eleanor of Aquitaine's engagement with vernacular literary culture reflects this pattern, as does the French language reading that is documented for various queens of the 13th and 14th centuries. By the 15th century, English prose literacy was sufficiently widespread among the gentry and noble classes to support the kind of correspondence and document management that figures like Margaret Beaufort used as instruments of political action, and the sophistication of Margaret's written communications reflects an education in practical literacy that was both the product of her social position and the enabling condition of her political effectiveness. The relationship between the Plantagenet queens and the English Church, as institution, as spiritual community, and as a political actor with its own interests and agendas, was one of the defining features of their experience and one of the most important contexts within which their activities unfolded. The Church provided queens with their most important source of formal public recognition through the coronation ceremony, which consecrated their role and gave it a theological legitimation that the secular dimension of queenship alone could not provide. The annual round of religious observance, the feast days, the fasts, the liturgical celebrations that structured the calendar of court life placed queens in a continuous relationship with the institutional church that provided both spiritual sustenance and political opportunity. The patronage of specific religious houses, the founding of chantries for the prayers of deceased family members, the cultivation of relationships with influential ecclesiastical figures, all of these activities connected queens to the institutional life of the church in ways that generated political returns alongside the spiritual ones. The political importance of maintaining good relations with the papacy, which was both a spiritual authority and a political player of considerable importance in the international politics of medieval Europe, was a dimension of this relationship whose management required the kind of sustained diplomatic attention that the most politically active queens provided. Eleanor of Aquitaine's correspondence with Alexander III, Isabella of France's cultivation of the papal curia as part of her campaign to justify and legitimate her political actions against Edward II, and the more general pattern of queenly attention to papal relationships throughout the Plantagenet period all reflect the political as well as the spiritual dimensions of the Queen's engagement with the institutional church. The specific forms that queenly piety took in the Plantagenet period varied considerably in their personal and political dimensions, but the most politically significant expressions of female religious commitment were those that combined genuine devotional engagement with the cultivation of relationships and reputations that had practical political value. The patronage of pilgrimage sites, which brought queens into contact with the broad social cross-section of medieval society that participated in pilgrimage culture, provided opportunities for the display of charitable generosity and personal accessibility that contributed to the popular reputation for mercy and compassion that chronicles like the Chronica Majora of Matthew Paris associated with queens, whose political conduct they approved. The specific pilgrimage destinations patronized by Plantagenet Queen's Canterbury, with its connection to Becket's martyrdom and its association with the complex relationship between the Plantagenet kings and the English Church, Walsingham, whose patronage connected queens to the specifically English Marian tradition, various continental shrines whose visitation demonstrated the international connections of the English royal family were chosen with a combination of personal devotion and political calculation that reflected the sophisticated understanding of the relationship between religious and political authority that the most effective queens possessed. The children of Plantagenet queens, beyond their significance as dynastic heirs and diplomatic instruments, represented a dimension of queenly responsibility whose management consumed enormous amounts of time, resource, and emotional energy. The care, education, and placement of royal children was a political project of the first importance, but it was also a deeply personal responsibility that the most capable queens managed with an intelligence and attentiveness that the surviving evidence only partially illuminates. The education of royal sons for the responsibilities of governance and military command, and of royal daughters for the marriage, alliances, and diplomatic roles they would eventually fill, required sustained attention to the selection of suitable households, tutors, and companions, and to the cultivation of the specific skills and knowledge that each child's future role would require. Eleanor of Aquitaine's management of her son's education, which placed Richard most closely within her own sphere of influence, and which transmitted to him the specific cultural and political traditions of Aquitaine, has already been discussed. But the broader pattern of queenly involvement in children's education was a persistent feature of Plantagenet governance that deserves acknowledgement as a dimension of political activity in its own right. The choices made in the education of royal children had long-term consequences for the character and capabilities of the rulers who eventually emerged from those educations, and the women who made or influenced those choices were exercising a form of political agency whose effects extended across generations. The final years of the Plantagenet dynasty, in the turbulent decades between the deposition of Richard II in 1399 and the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, represented in certain respects the most demanding test that the women of the dynasty faced, as the breakdown of the political consensus that had sustained Plantagenet governance created conditions of persistent instability, factional violence, and dynastic uncertainty that required extraordinary personal resilience and political capability from those who navigated them successfully. The women who appear most prominently in this period, Margaret of Anjou, Elizabeth Woodville, Anne Neville, Margaret Beaufort, were all shaped by the specific circumstances of a time when the rules of political engagement had been altered by the sustained dynastic conflict of the wars between the houses of Lancaster and York, and when the personal and institutional loyalties that normally structured political activity were subject to sudden reversal and violent redefinition. The fact that all four of these women survived the extraordinary political upheavals of the mid-15th century, and that two of them, Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort, played active roles in the establishment of the Tudor dynasty that brought the Plantagenet era to its close, testifies to the adaptability and the political intelligence that the most capable women of the dynasty consistently demonstrated in the face of circumstances that would have destroyed less determined actors. The Plantagenet The dynasty's legacy to the subsequent history of England was transmitted through multiple channels, of which the most immediately visible was the direct dynastic succession from Richard III to Henry VII that transferred the crown to the Tudor line. But the institutional, legal, cultural, and constitutional legacies of 3.5 centuries of Plantagenet governance were equally significant, and the women of the dynasty had contributed to all of them in ways that the formal record of institutional development only partially acknowledges. The common law that developed through the Plantagenet centuries incorporated women's property rights through the provisions of Magna Carta and subsequent legislation. The parliamentary institutions that grew from the baronial assemblies of the 12th century to the more formally constituted parliaments of the 14th had engaged with questions of women's rights and interests throughout their development. The cultural institutions, the colleges, the churches, the literary traditions that the most culturally active queens had patronized represented accumulations of institutional investment whose effects continued long after the dynasty itself had ended. The England that Henry VII inherited in August 1485 was the product of 3.5 centuries of Plantagenet governance, and the women who had contributed to that governance had shaped the inheritance that the Tudor dynasty received in ways whose full significance only becomes apparent when the entire span of the Plantagenet period is considered with the praised attention to women's activities that the evidence demands and that the historical tradition has too long withheld. The succession of women who served as queens of England during the Plantagenet period constituted, taken together, one of the most extraordinary collective political careers in European medieval history. Across more than 300 years, from Matilda of Scotland, whose son Henry I established the conditions for the Plantagenet succession, through Margaret Beaufort, who engineered the transition to the Tudor dynasty, women occupied the position of Queen of England with a variety of capabilities, circumstances, and personal characters that defy any single generalization. What they shared was not a particular political style or a consistent set of strategic priorities, but a common structural position at once central to the dynastic enterprise and marginal to the formal structures of governance, that required each of them to find her own way of exercising the capabilities available to her within the specific constraints of her time and situation. The diversity of their responses to this common situation is itself one of the most illuminating aspects of the Plantagenet women's story, revealing the range of political strategies available to women who were determined to exercise political agency within a framework that formally denied it to them. Empress Matilda's response was direct confrontation. She claimed the throne in her own right and fought for it with military and political means, achieving partial success at enormous personal cost, and ultimately transmitting her claim to her son rather than realizing it herself. Eleanor of Aquitaine's response was the cultivation of an independent territorial and cultural identity that gave her a political base outside the framework of her marriage, and that she maintained through decades of adversity, including 15 years of imprisonment, to exercise at the end of her life with undiminished effectiveness. Isabella of France's response was the organization of a successful revolution that deposed a king and established a new reign, exercising power as regent for her son before being herself displaced by the political maturity of the child she had worked to put on the throne. Margaret of Anjou's response was sustained military and diplomatic resistance to political displacement, refusing to accept the defeat of her cause through 2 decades of exile, poverty, and military reversal, ultimately failing, but leaving a record of determination that exceeded what most male political actors of her time could have maintained in comparable circumstances. Margaret Beaufort's response was patient accumulation of legal expertise, financial security, political connections, and personal authority deployed over decades in the service of a dynastic project whose realization she lived to see, but whose achievement required the sustained political intelligence of a lifetime, rather than the dramatic intervention of a single moment. These different responses reflect not only the different personalities and circumstances of the women who made them, but also the different political possibilities available at different moments in the Plantagenet period. The political culture of the 12th century, in which the personal authority of great lords and the loyalty relationships between them were the primary mechanisms of governance, created different opportunities and different constraints for politically active women than the more institutionalized political culture of the 15th century, in which Parliament, the common law, and the sophisticated financial infrastructure of the London merchant community all played significant roles in the management of political conflict. The women who were most effective in each period were those who best understood the specific mechanisms of political power available in their particular historical context, and who deployed those mechanisms with the greatest skill. Determination. The common thread that connects them across the enormous diversity of their circumstances is precisely this quality of intelligent, determined, adaptive engagement with the political possibilities of their specific situations, a quality that the formal structures of Plantagenet governance consistently failed to eliminate because it was rooted not in institutional position, but in personal capability and political will. The significance of the Plantagenet women's story extends beyond the specific history of the English dynasty and the English kingdom to illuminate broader questions about the pair's relationship between gender, power, and political agency in medieval European history. The experiences of Plantagenet queens were not unique to England. Comparable patterns of female political agency can be traced in the Capetian dynasty of France, in the Holy Roman Empire, in the Iberian kingdoms, and in the various other political entities of medieval Europe. But the particular richness and continuity of the English historical record, combined with the specific characteristics of the Plantagenet political tradition, make the English case an exceptionally well-documented example of a broader European phenomenon. The systematic study of Plantagenet women's political activities thus contributes not only to the specific history of England, but to the comparative history of medieval European political culture and to the broader understanding of how gender operated as a category of political analysis in the pre-modern world. The conclusion that emerges from this examination that women's political agency was real, sustained, and consequential throughout the Plantagenet period, even when it operated through channels that the formal structures of governance did not recognize or acknowledge, is a conclusion whose implications extend well beyond the chronological and geographical boundaries of the specific history that has been its occasion. The sleep that follows the contemplation of these lives, if sleep comes, is earned rest after a journey through centuries of extraordinary human activity conducted under the most demanding possible conditions. The women of the Plantagenet dynasty were not figures in a tapestry, but actors in a story whose stakes were as high as any that medieval Europe produced: the survival of dynasties, the governance of kingdoms, the preservation of cultural and legal traditions whose influence extended across centuries and continents. They navigated those stakes with capabilities that their contemporaries sometimes acknowledged and sometimes refused to see, with political intelligence that the formal structures of their time could not fully contain, and with personal determination that the greatest adversities they faced, imprisonment, exile, bereavement, poverty, political humiliation, consistently failed to extinguish. The history of the Plantagenet dynasty is, at its fullest and most complete, inseparable from their history, and the English kingdom that emerged from 3.5 centuries of their collective effort bears their mark, as surely as it bears the mark of the kings whose names it more immediately recalls. The rest that follows the contemplation of their extraordinary lives is, in its quiet way, a form of tribute to the persistence that characterized the best of them, the capacity to endure, to continue, and when the moment came, to act. The continuity of female political engagement across the full span of the Plantagenet period was not merely a series of individual exceptional cases, but a structural feature of the dynasty's political life that reflected the genuinely indispensable role that women played in maintaining the dynastic enterprise through the inevitable crises that periodically threatened to destroy it. Each generation of Plantagenet kings produced, alongside its male heirs and its political administrators, women whose capabilities were called upon at moments of crisis and whose responses to those moments of crisis shaped the subsequent trajectory of the dynasty in ways that the formal record of royal governance does not always clearly reveal. The pattern is consistent enough, and the contributions documented in the surviving evidence sufficiently significant to support the conclusion that the Plantagenet dynasty's remarkable longevity, more than 3 centuries of continuous rule over England, was in substantial part a product of the political capabilities that its women brought to the maintenance of dynastic continuity through the recurring crises that the dynasty faced. Without Empress Matilda, there would have been no Plantagenet dynasty. Without Eleanor of Aquitaine, it would have lacked the continental character and cultural vitality that gave it its specific historical identity. Without Isabella of France, the dysfunction of Edward II's reign might have produced a dynastic collapse that the succession of Edward III would not have been available to prevent. Without Margaret of Anjou, the Lancastrian line would have collapsed a generation earlier than it did. Without Margaret Beaufort, the Tudor resolution of the dynastic crisis might not have been available when the political conditions for it finally emerged. Each of these contributions was irreplaceable in the specific historical context that required it, and together they constitute a record of female political agency whose significance to the history of England and of medieval Europe deserves the fullest possible recognition. The transmission of the Plantagenet legacy through the Tudor succession was itself a process in which women were the primary agents, as the foregoing account has demonstrated at length, and the specific mechanisms of that transmission, the biological connection through Catherine of Valois and Owen Tudor, the political engineering of Margaret Beaufort, the dynastic alliance negotiated through the marriage of Elizabeth of York, were all achievements that required the sustained political agency of women operating within and around the institutional constraints of late Plantagenet. Governance. The England that emerged from the long Plantagenet period into the Tudor era bore the accumulated marks of 3.5 centuries of female political engagement at every level of the dynasty's governance, from the foundational marriage that created the Angevin inheritance to the careful political navigation that preserved the dynastic claim through decades of civil conflict and eventually delivered it to a new house. The story of the women who shaped the Plantagenet dynasty is therefore not merely the story of a series of remarkable individuals, but the story of how political agency operated in medieval England at its most demanding, and of what that agency could achieve when it was exercised with the intelligence, the determination, and the sustained commitment that the best of these women brought to the responsibilities and the opportunities of their extraordinary historical positions. The institutional memory of the Plantagenet dynasty, preserved in the chronicles, the administrative records, the legal documents, and the physical monuments that have survived the centuries since its end, provides the evidence from which the story of its women can be reconstructed with the detail and the analytical depth that their significance demands. That reconstruction is not merely an exercise in historical recovery, but an act of historical justice and the restoration to the record of capabilities and contributions that the formal structures of a patriarchal political culture had, partially concealed, and whose full recognition enriches rather than distorts our understanding of one of the most consequential periods in the history of England and of medieval Europe. The women of the Plantagenet dynasty deserve to be known not as the shadows of their more famous male relatives, but as political actors in their own right, whose contributions to the dynasty's history were as real and as consequential as those of the kings whose names and deeds fill the conventional narrative of the period. This account has attempted to restore something of that recognition to a selection of the most significant among them, knowing that the record is inevitably incomplete and that the women it has not been possible to discuss in detail, the daughters, the wives of barons, the abbesses and prioresses, the merchant wives and the peasant women who constituted the vast majority of the female population of Plantagenet England, also shaped the world that the queens governed, in ways whose full significance remains to be explored in the ongoing work of historical scholarship that the richness of the Plantagenet record continues to sustain and reward.